Yuri's fingers slipped off his little finger. Not abruptly, slowly. Like setting aside a broken object you no longer intend to repair. Han Doyun stood on the marble floor of the throne room and watched as 10 years dissolved into nothingness. Crown Prince Chogon Ho smiled broadly and warmly. He said he had wonderful news. He said there were 3 villages on the Peksan border and they needed a shed repairman. He said Doyun could handle it. And then he turned to Yuri and added that it wasn't fitting for a girl of her bloodline to be freezing next to a man who repairs outhouses. The hall burst into laughter. 300 people. Graduates of the Cheongmyong Academy. Mentors. Advisors. Lords and their entourages. 300 throats roared with laughter at the young man with a dull blue-gray seal on his collarbone. F-class. Builder. A beggar's lantern. Someone from the back rows tossed a copper liang onto the marble floor. The coin spun at Doyun's feet and landed with the coat of arms facing down. Someone shouted that it was for an instrument. Another burst of laughter. The captain of the palace guard stepped forward and snatched the academic token from Doyun's belt, a badge earned over 6 years of study. For first place in the theory of sieges. For the highest grade in hydrodynamics. The captain snapped it in half against his knee in a single motion and tossed the shards at his feet. Yuri stood 3 paces away. She did not meet his gaze. Her father, Marquis Sun Gi-hoon, sat in the front row of the Council of 12 and nodded with the expression of a man who had crossed out an unnecessary line in an accounting ledger. He had signed the engagement contract with the prince 3 weeks ago, back when Doyun was taking his final exams and drafting a drainage system design for his thesis. While he still believed that by fall, he and Yuri would be assigned to the capital's garrison. While he still thought the surname Han meant something. Doyun bent down. He picked up the copper ryung. He put it in his pocket. He straightened up. The hall was still laughing, but more quietly now. Someone noticed that the guy with an F rank wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't trembling. He stood upright and looked at the prince. Not at Yuri, not at the marquis, at the prince. And he took 3 steps forward. The guards flinched, but Doyun stopped exactly at the boundary of the protocol distance. He knew it down to the centimeter. He measured everything, in fact. Doyun spoke quietly, so quietly that only Choi Gon-ho could hear him. He said that one day Your Highness would stand at his gate, and he would decide whether to let him in. The prince blinked. The smile didn't fade, but it lingered for a split second, like a mechanism in which something had creaked. Then Doyun turned and walked toward the exit. Past the laughing guests, past Yuri, who for the first time that evening looked up to watch him go. Past the marquis, who had already forgotten about him and was discussing with his neighbor the price of wine for the engagement feast. The heavy doors closed behind him. The hallway was empty and cold. Doyun stopped by a column. He pressed his palm against the stone. The masonry was shoddy. He could feel it with his skin. The mortar was mixed with sand. The blocks were laid against the grain. A crack in the load-bearing joint would appear in 12 years, and the ceiling would sag. The royal palace, the heart of the empire, and the masonry was as shoddy as a village outhouse. He withdrew his hand and walked on. At the barracks, the graduates were given their orders. Peksan border post, 3 villages, a population of 420 souls. The task, repair farm buildings. Pay, 7 leon per month. The seal of the allocation bureau. No horse, no cart, no lifting equipment. The clerk didn't even look up as he handed over the scroll. They don't look builders in the eye. Doyun took the scroll and left. That night, he returned to the burned-out estate of the Han clan on the outskirts of the capital. The roof had collapsed 2 years ago when the crown requisitioned the land due to the line's unprofitability. The walls were still standing. Walls always lasted the longest because Han Soryon's great-grandfather had built them the old-fashioned way, the way the empire had decided to forget. Doyun went down to the basement. He shifted a stone slab that no one but him had ever moved. From a hiding place, he retrieved a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. 744 pages. The Sonryon Atlas, the only surviving collection of blueprints from the pre-war school of seal architects. Formulas for weaving mana into masonry. Diagrams of self-repairing walls. Recipes for concrete with a woven runic grid. Doyun had read it 3 times over the course of 3 years. He knew every formula by heart. He could reproduce every drawing with his eyes closed. No one knew. Not his mentors. Not his classmates. Not Yuri. His father had taught him one rule before he even taught him to read. You don't show your strong hand when you're dealing. Doyun rolled up the atlas again. He put it in his travel bag. Next to it lay an axe, a shovel, a charcoal pencil, a copper liang from the throne room. He went upstairs. He stood at the threshold. He looked out at the capital. The palace lights were glowing on the hill. Somewhere out there, the prince was pouring wine for Yuri. Somewhere out there, Marquis Sun Gi-hoon believed he had eliminated the last obstacle. Somewhere out there, the Tower of Seals slept peacefully because the whole world still believed that power was measured by how much you could burn. Doyun slung the sack over his shoulder. The seal on his collarbone glowed a blue-gray. A beggar's lantern. He smirked. For the first time all day, and he set off north. The journey to Peksan took 11 days. There was no caravan route to the north. There was only a dirt road, washed out by rain and clogged with refugees' carts moving in the opposite direction, away from the border, away from the orcs, away from the villages that burned every 3rd week. Doyun walked against the flow. The sack pulled at his shoulder. The atlas weighed as much as a good-sized cobblestone. On the 4th day, he passed Namcheon, or rather what used to be Namcheon. Burnt-out log cabins, charred palisade posts jutted out of the ground like rotten teeth. The stench was so thick that Doyun had to breathe through his sleeve. The orcs had passed through here a month ago. 400 souls. No one had survived. That's a lie. One had survived. Doyun found her on the 5th day. The girl was sitting by the road, counting stones. Literally. She'd pick up a stone from the pile on the left, move it to the right, mumble a number, pick up the next one. She was about 16 or 17. Filthy. Her ribs were visible through her shirt. Her eyes were empty, but her hands moved with precision. Doyun stopped. He asked her name. Jo Minsu. He asked where she was from. Namcheon. He asked what she was doing. She said she was counting. 387. 388. Doyun sat down beside her. He asked why. Minsu said that if she stopped, she'd remember. Doyun was silent for a moment. He took half a flatbread out of his half a flatbread. He placed it next to her. He said he was going to Baeksan. He said he needed someone who could count. Minsu looked at him for the first time. She looked at the seal on his collarbone. Class F. A dim blue-gray light. She didn't laugh. She said 389. She took the flatbread. She stood up. She followed him. Baeksan met them on the 11th day. 3 villages, if you could call them that. Crooked houses. A palisade of thin poles that wouldn't stop even a drunken ox. A well with murky water. Fields trampled by the latest raid. 420 people who looked at the capital city graduate with the builder's seal as if he were a bad joke. Village head Oh Chang-sik came out to meet them. 62 years old. His left arm wouldn't bend because of an old fracture. A former centurion. 20 years on the border. The capital had stolen his pension. He looked at the order. He looked at Doyun. He said they'd sent a shed repairman. Doyun said yes. Chang-sik spat and said the sheds were on the west side. Doyun didn't go to the sheds. He went to the palisade. He stood in front of it. He placed his palm on a stake. The wood was damp. It had been set up crookedly. The base was rotten. He closed his eyes and for the first time in a long while allowed himself to do something he hadn't done at the academy. He opened his inner vision. Mana flowed beneath the ground. He felt it like a pulse. Warm currents, cold currents, nodes where they intersected, and one knot, right beneath the village well, powerful, deep, untouched for 1,000 years. A Sonryon-class geomantic knot. In this forgotten backwater on the edge of the empire, beneath a filthy well, lay a source that could sustain a fortress for 1,000 years. Doyun opened his eyes. Village Chief Chang-sik was standing nearby, waiting. Doyun said he would start with the well. Chang-sik asked what was wrong with the well. Doyun replied that everything was wrong. He began working that very day. First, he dug a new well. More precisely, he deepened the old one and shifted it 4 meters to the east, exactly to the node. He worked alone, using only a shovel and his hands. Minsu sat nearby and counted the stones he threw away. By evening, Doyun had reached the aquifer. The water that flowed was clear and cold. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that he had woven the first formula from the atlas into the well's masonry. Resonance anchor. The stones laid in the Sonrion spiral began to exchange mana with one another. The well became an anchor, a reference point for everything he planned to build next. His internal counter shifted. Apprentice 1. 120 units of structural mana. Nothing. A drop. But the first drop in a reservoir he intended to fill to the brim. The village elder tasted the water from the new well and fell silent for 10 seconds. Then he said that in 30 years on the border, he hadn't drunk anything purer. Doyun nodded. He moved on to the palisade. During the first week, he dismantled the western wall of the palisade. The residents grumbled. They said he'd lost his mind, that without the wall, the orcs would come, that the capital had sent them a fool. Doyun didn't argue. He worked. He got up before dawn. He went to bed after midnight. He chopped stone. He hewn wood. He dug. He wove formulas into every block he laid. By the second week, the western wall was ready. Stone instead of stakes, 3 cubits thick, 2 human heights tall. Every block laid according to the formula of resonant masonry. Old man Chansik approached and knocked on the wall with his fist. He pulled his hand back. He looked at his fist. He looked at the wall. He looked at Doyun. And for the first time in 11 days, he didn't call him kid. He called him master. Master Han. Doyun continued working. The third week, the north wall. The fourth, the east wall. The fifth, the south wall and the gate. He had embedded the clenched jaw seal into the gate. The rune activates in the presence of hostile mana. When an enemy approaches, the gate locks itself. The greater the pressure, the tighter the lock. By the 6th week, Peksan was enclosed within a ring. On paper, a small village, a palisade. Nothing special. According to Doyun's internal counter, Mason, Tier 2, 4,200 units of structural mana, stored in stone, in wood, in the earth, in the well water. The mana didn't burn or explode. It lay within the walls like blood in veins. Quiet, patient, growing. Minsu kept records. She didn't understand half of what she was writing down, but she memorized the numbers instantly. Doyun showed her the first page of the atlas, just the first one. Minsu read it. She looked up. She asked how many pages like that there were. Doyun replied that there were 743 more. Minsu said she needed a brush and a larger sheet of paper. The 6th week was drawing to a close. At night, Doyun stood on the wall and looked north. A glow was burning there. The orcs were burning something beyond the hills. They were heading south. Every season, every month, closer and closer. A village sentry said he'd seen scouts at the pass, 3 orcs, one of them larger than the rest. Doyun asked how much larger. The sentry gestured with his palm half a meter above his own head. Doyun nodded. He climbed down from the wall and walked the gate. He ran his hand over the stone. The stone was warm. Mana hummed inside it like a thick, low sound that you hear not with your ears but with your ribs. 4,200 units. That should be enough against an S rank. It should. Doyun returned to the blueprints. The orcs would be here in the morning. They arrived at dawn. 40 orcs. Heavy infantry with iron axes and bone shields. The chieftain led the way. Urgath. Over 2 meters tall. A necklace of human fingers around his neck. Not for beauty, to keep count. Each finger represented a village he had burned. Doyun counted 32 fingers on the string. Urgat was ranked C-class on the human scale. That meant a single blow from his fist could break through a stone wall an elbow thick. A single battle cry from him could deafen anyone within 50 meters. A single rift spell snaps a fortress gate like a dry twig. That is exactly how Namchan fell. That is exactly how 31 other villages fell before it. The residents of Peksan stood behind the wall. Women and children in the cellars, men with rickety spears on the ramparts. Village head Changsik stood next to it with Doyun on the gatehouse platform, gripping the hilt of his old sword so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He said that last time they had fled. That 2 years ago the orcs had come, and they had fled into the forest, returning only after everything had burned down and 2/3 of the houses lay in ashes. He said that this time there was nowhere to flee because the forest behind them had been burning for 3 days ago. Doyun didn't answer. He was watching the orcs, counting them. 40 fighters, 12 archers, 1 battering ram, a log on chains carried by 8 orcs. The gates of any border village can withstand 3 blows from a battering ram. On the 4th, they break. That's the standard. Doyun knew this because he'd written a term paper on exactly that topic, on strength standards that hadn't changed in 200 years because nobody cared. He looked at his own gate. The clenched jaw seal glowed faintly in the morning light. Urgot raised his fist. The orcs stopped 100 meters away. The chieftain surveyed the wall. He tilted his head. Something was wrong, and he could feel it. The wall wasn't made of wood. It was stone. But stone was no obstacle to an S rank. Urgot roared a command. The battering ram moved forward. 8 orcs charged. The log slammed into the gate with a blow that made the ground shake beneath their feet. Doyun stood on the wall and didn't move. The gate didn't crack. The gate didn't bend. The gate absorbed the blow. The clenched jaw seal flared with a dim blue light, and the resonant masonry absorbed 60% of the kinetic energy, converting it into its own strength. The gate became harder. The orcs struck again. Absorption. Compaction. Harder still. The 3rd blow. The 4th. The 5th. With each blow, the glow within the stone grew brighter. Elder Changsik watched this and couldn't close his mouth. He had served on the border for 20 years. He had seen walls break. He had never seen a wall feed on itself. On the 6th blow, the battering ram's wood cracked. On the 7th, the ram split in half. The recoil from its own impact traveled along the chains and broke the wrists of 2 orcs. They threw aside the debris and howled. Urgot stood before the gate and looked at them. For the first time in his life, the gate did not give way. He roared. He ordered them to scale the walls. 20 orcs with hooks and ropes began climbing upward. They were halfway up when Doyun said quietly, "Second circuit." The resonant masonry in the walls activated a second function. Runic spikes emerged from the cracks between the stones, thin as nails, hard as diamond, activated by the presence of hostile mana. The orcs carried dark mana within them, like all creatures of the abyss. The spikes sensed it and struck with precision. 8 orcs fell from the wall within the first 3 seconds. 4 crashed onto their palms and hung there screaming. The rest jumped down. Changsik exhaled through clenched teeth. He looked at Doyun. Doyun stood calmly, hands behind his back, a pencil tucked behind his ear, as if he were watching a training session rather than a battle. Urgot had lost 12 fighters in 4 minutes and hadn't even breached the gate. He did what S-rankers do when they get angry. He decided to do it all himself. He stepped forward. He planted his feet. He raised both hands. Mana around him swirled into a black vortex. The Rift spell. An S-rank combat technique. A direct strike of concentrated destructive mana. It shatters stone. It shatters iron. It shatters bones. It shatters everything built by human hands. Or so he thought. The black beam struck the wall. The stones trembled. A glow in the masonry flared up in a blinding blue. The resonant masonry absorbed the energy. But not all of it. Doyun had woven yet another formula from the Atlas into this wall. The formula of return. The wall absorbed the spell, converted it, and returned 50% of the energy as a backwave, straight at Urgot. The orc chieftain took his own spell head-on. He was thrown 20 meters back. He crashed into the ground and didn't get up. His body was smoldering. The necklace made of his fingers scattered across the grass. 32 fingers, 32 villages. Peksan did not become the 33rd. The remaining orcs stood and watched. 28 pairs of eyes. The chieftain is dead. The battering ram is broken. The wall stands intact. They ran, disorganized, without a command, like a herd whose leader had been slain. In 7 minutes, it was all over. Doyun stood on the wall and counted. 40 had come. 12 lay dead at the walls. Urgat lay dead on the field. 27 were fleeing north. Minsu stood below at the gate with a notepad. Doyun looked down at her from above. He told her to write it down. Absorption. 412 units for an S-rank spell. Good return. Minsu wrote it down, number by number.
She didn't understand exactly what she had written. In 6 months, she would understand. And that number would turn the empire upside down. Changsik approached Doyun. The old man's hands were trembling, not from fear, from something else. He said he hadn't seen anything like this in 20 years. He said the wall was alive. He said it wasn't F-rank. Doyun looked at him calmly and replied that it was indeed F-rank. Just an F-rank that knows how to build. Changsik shook his head. And he said quietly, addressing the wall rather than Doyun. He said it wasn't on their scale at all. Down below on the field, among the bodies and the wreckage of the battering ram, lay Urgat's necklace. 32 fingers from 32 villages. Doyun climbed down from the wall. He picked up the necklace. He placed it on a stone by the gate. Someday there would be a stele here, with names, with all the names. But right now he had no time for remembrance. He looked north. There were still many orcs there, and beyond the orcs lay the border. And beyond the border were those who paid the orcs, the Twilight Court. But that was for later. Right now, he had 4,612 units of structural mana. Right now, he had a village that had survived its first battle. And right now, somewhere on a hill beyond the forest, someone was watching all of this through a spyglass. Doyun knew it. He felt the gaze just as he felt the cracks in the stone. Someone was watching. Someone had seen it. Someone was already writing a report. An Imperial scout named No Sujin sat on the hill, trying to remember how to breathe. The spyglass lay in the grass. He had dropped it when the C-rank rift spell ricocheted off the village wall and killed the orc chieftain. Scout No Sujin had served at Northern Army headquarters for 12 years. His job was simple. Ride to a village that would soon be destroyed. Wait for it to be destroyed. Record the date and number of casualties. Return with a report. Peksan was his 43rd assignment. The 42 previous ones had ended the same way. He would arrive. He would watch. The village would burn. He would write a report. The capital would file the report away. No one did anything. The northern border had been feeding the empire with dead villages for 4 years now, and everyone had grown accustomed to it. Sujin picked up the telescope from the grass. He aimed it at Peksan again. A young man in gray work clothes stood by the wall, a charcoal pencil tucked behind his ear. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't shouting. He was talking to a girl who was writing something down on a small board. Sujin looked at the corpses in front of the wall. He looked at the wreckage of the battering ram. He looked at Urgat's body, from which smoke was still rising, and he began to write his report. It wasn't a standard report. For the first time in 12 years, he was writing a report in which the village hadn't been burned to the ground. 4 days later, the report was on General Pak Moon-ho's desk. Commander of the Northern Army, B+ rank, 56 years old. His face was like a topographic map of scars. 28 years on the border. He hated the capital with the quiet, steady hatred of a man who had been betrayed so often he had lost count. The general read the report. He read it a second time. He summoned Sujin. He asked if he had been drunk when he wrote it. Sujin replied that he was sober and that he had a sketch of the wall. The general looked at the sketch. He looked at Sujin.
He ordered his horse to be saddled. 2 days later, General Pak Moon-ho stood before the Paesan wall in person. He did not summon Doyun. He approached the wall on his own. He removed his glove. He placed his palm on the stone. And he froze. The general was a B+ ranked warrior, not a mage. But 30 years of combat experience had given him a sensitivity to mana that no academy could teach. He could feel a pulse, deep, steady. Mana flowed through the stone like blood through veins. Not in jerks, not in flashes. A stream, a steady, growing stream. The general withdrew his hand. He turned to his aide. He spoke quietly, telling him to write down the name. Han. He memorized it, and added that this wasn't an F rank, that it wasn't on their scale at all. Then he entered the village. Doyun met him at the gate. He didn't bow. According to etiquette, an F-class builder is required to bow to a B rank down to the waist. Doyun nodded, as an equal. The general noticed. He said nothing. He walked through the village. He inspected the walls, the well, the drainage ditch, the foundations of the houses that Doyun had already begun rebuilding. He stopped at the northern wall, where the stone still bore traces of a C-rank rift spell, a black scorch mark on the surface. But beneath the scorch, the stone was more intact than before the impact. The general touched the scorch mark. He whistled. He turned to Doyun and asked what kind of formula was used in the masonry. Doyun replied that it was his own design. The general snorted and said he'd never seen an F-rank design that could withstand a C-rank spell. Doyun replied that now he had. The general laughed, briefly and hoarsely, for the first time in a long while. Then he stopped laughing. He grew serious. He said that winter would be here in 2 months, that the orcs go wild in winter, that the raids will become more frequent, that last winter they lost 16 villages and 4,000 lives. He asked what Doyun needed. Doyun replied that he needed stone, lots of stone, and time. The general nodded. He said he would provide the stone, but Doyun would have to fight for the time himself. He left that very day. But he left something behind. A note for the commanders of the nearest garrisons. 3 words. Do not touch Paesan. 3 words that carried more weight than an order from the capital. Because in the north, General Park's word was law, and the capital's word was mere noise. Doyun returned to work. The stone began arriving a week later. Wagons from the nearest quarry. Rough unwork. Perfect for resonant masonry. Doyun worked from dawn until midnight, without a day off. First, he reinforced the foundations of the residential buildings, geomantically anchoring them to the node beneath the well. Each house became part of the network. Mana flowed from the well through the foundations like water through pipes. The houses grew warmer. The walls stopped freezing through. The roofs, which he had built according to the Atlas's formulas, shed snow on their own. Not magic in the conventional sense. Structure, angle of inclination, the texture of the roof tiles. Mana woven into the mortar created micro-vibrations that prevented snow from sticking. A simple solution, elegant, invisible. Then came the sewer system. Paesan stood on a slope, and for 300 years, sewage had flowed right down the street. In 10 days, Doyun laid stone pipes underground. He diverted the flow into a ravine behind the southern wall. For the first time in 3 centuries, Paesan didn't stink. The residents couldn't believe it. They walked along the clean streets and looked around as if they'd wandered into a stranger's village. Then came the heated floors. Doyun discovered a diagram of a hypocaust in the Atlas. It was a system of underground channels through which hot air from a central furnace spreads beneath the floors of all the buildings. 1 furnace for the whole village. Fired with wood. Warmth everywhere. He built the hypocaust over 3 weeks. Alone. Minsu helped with the calculations. Her perfect memory for numbers turned out to be a gift, not a quirk. She memorized the length of every pipe, the angle of every turn, the depth of every trench. Doyun dictated, and she wrote it down. He showed her the 2nd page of the atlas, then the 3rd. Minso read and her eyes burned. Not with the blue-gray light of a beggar's lantern, with a different kind of fire, the fire of a person seeing for the first time that the world is not as they were told. By the end of the second month, Pekson had changed. The walls stood strong, the streets were clean, the houses were warm, the water was clean, the sewer system worked. The heated floors provided warmth. Doyun had risen to Mason III. 8,000 units of structural mana. The count rose with every stone, with every pipe, with every woven pattern. A harsh winter set in. -30 in the first week, blizzards. The mountain passes were buried in snow. Caravans carrying provisions from the capital came to a standstill, as always, just like every winter. The north was left on its own. But in Pekson, it was warm. In Pekson, there was clean water. In Pekson, there were grain reserves that Doyun had stored in a vault built into a geomantic node. The grain neither rotted nor froze. Meanwhile, in the neighboring crown domains, people began to die. Cold, hunger, disease. The village of Sungwon, 20 li to the west, lost a third of its population in a month. The village of Hamri to the east buried 40 children before the first snowfall. Crown officials sat in their warm offices and wrote reports. No one died in Pekson, not a single person. The rumors spread along the border like wildfire. That up north there was a village where it was warm and there was plenty to eat, where the walls didn't burn or crumble, where a master builder with an F-rank seal ruled, one who made the impossible possible. People began flocking to Pekson. At first, one by one. A family from Sunwon, an old blacksmith from Hamri. Then in groups, refugees, fire victims, those who had nowhere else to go. Doyun welcomed them all. He expanded the walls. He built new houses. The count grew. 9,000, 10, 11,000 units. Mason IV. And Doyun knew that soon, it wouldn't just be the refugees who would find out about this. Soon the capital would find out. Soon Marquis Song Gi-hoon would find out. And then it wouldn't be orcs who would come. The first blow from the capital came not with a sword, but with a piece of paper. The third month of winter. Doyun was standing on the northern wall, inspecting the masonry after a nighttime blizzard, when Minsu brought him a scroll bearing the imperial seal. Down below, at the gate, an official from the provincial administration was waiting. A low-ranking official. A minor foot soldier. But the seal on the scroll was not a provincial one. It was the seal of the Council of 12. Doyun unrolled the scroll. An inspection order. Pekson had been declared a site of heightened scrutiny due to reports of unlicensed construction of defensive structures by a non-combatant. Signed, Marquis Son Gi-hoon, head of the Council of 12. Doyun read it. He rolled it back up. Calmly. He had been expecting this. Not quite so soon, but he had been expecting it. Rumors about Pekson had been circulating for 3 months. Someone had snitched. One of the capital's officials had heard about the village that wasn't burning and had asked about it. The question reached the Marquis. The Marquis learned the name. Han Do-yun. That very same F-rank boy whom he had cast out to the border to die. Alive. Not just alive. Building. Doyun went down to the gate. The official was waiting. Young, nervous. Clearly didn't want to be here. Clearly didn't want to travel north in winter for the sake of some builder in the middle of nowhere. Doyun let him in. He led him through the village, showed him the walls, the well, the sewer system, the heated floors, the hospital he'd finished building last week, the grain storage. The official watched and turned pale. Not from fear, from bewilderment. He'd come to inspect a barn repairman. He saw a fortified outpost capable of withstanding a siege. He asked how many mages had worked on it. Doyun replied that there were none. The official asked again. Doyun repeated himself. Not a single mage, just one F-class builder. The official took notes. His hands were shaking, but he wrote it down. He left the next morning. 3 weeks later, a second scroll arrived. A summons to a hearing at the provincial court regarding unlicensed fortification construction. A fine or arrest. At the court's discretion. But before the summons reached Pekson, something else happened. A blacksmith. Yoon Taegwon appeared at the gate in the 4th month. A sturdy man. Broad shoulders. Hands covered in burns and calluses. Angry eyes. B rank on the combat scale. Expelled from the capital's blacksmith's guild for illegal experiments with rune steel. Actually, for refusing to pay a kickback. He was heading north at random. He heard about Pexon at a roadside tavern. He came to check it out. Doyun came out to meet him.
Taekwon looked at his seal.
F-class. He snorted. He said he'd heard about a master builder but saw only a boy. Doyun replied calmly. He said he needed a blacksmith who knows how to work with rune steel. That he had blueprints. That the fasteners and reinforcements based on these blueprints would double the strength of his walls. Taekwon asked what kind of blueprints they were. Doyun showed him a single page from the atlas. Just one. A diagram of rune fasteners. Taekwon took the page. He looked at it. For a long time. A minute. 2. 3. Then he looked up. The anger was gone. There was something else in his eyes. Hunger. The hunger of a master who had seen work worthy of his hands. He asked where the forge was. Doyun said there was no forge. Taekwon nodded and said there would be one by morning. He wasn't lying. By morning, he had built a forge out of stone and clay. By evening, he was forging the first runic pin. Doyun watched him work. Taekwon was B rank. His combat mana flowed into the hammer. Every blow wove a rune into the metal. Rough, powerful, lacking elegance but with unquestionable precision. The first pin was driven into the wall.
Doyun felt the mana grid tremble and realign.
The wall became a single monolith. Before, the stones had exchanged mana with one another. Now the steel pin bound them into a single chain. The strength doubled. Doyun checked the meter. A jump of 1,200 units from a single pin. He looked at Taekwon. Taekwon looked at him. Doyun told him to keep forging. Taekwon grinned. For the first time since they'd started talking. And he began forging. The 5th month. Winter still held its grip, but its hold was weakening. The days were growing longer, and with the longer days came a new trouble. Not orcs. Humans. 60 of them. Armed, organized. Black armbands on their left shoulders. The Black Crane clan. Mercenaries. Officially a gang that robs the northern trade routes. Unofficially, the blade that Marquis Sun Gi-hoon uses for work that isn't recorded in official documents. They appeared from the south. Not from the north. Not from the orcs. From the capital. Min-soo was the first to spot them. She was sitting in the tower, counting the clouds, an activity Doyun didn't forbid her from doing because, among the clouds, she could spot anything that moved within a 3-li radius.
60 figures on the southern road.
On horseback. Armed. Min-soo came down and reported. Doyun wasn't surprised. The court summons hadn't worked. The Marquis had moved on to the second option, a bandit raid. On paper, it was a mercenary army up to B rank. The commander of the Black Crane clan, Bae Yeonju, B rank. A swordswoman. 142 contracts under her belt. Not a single failure. She drove up to the gate. Stopped. Surveyed the wall. Doyun was standing on top. She shouted up from below that he had a beautiful wall. Said it would be a shame to ruin it. Proposed a deal. He opens the gate. They take what they need. They'll stage the destruction. He'll write a report about a gang raid. Everyone's alive. Everyone's happy. Doyun looks down at her from above. He paused. Then he replied with a single sentence. He said his wall had withstood a C-rank rift spell and asked if she was sure. Ba Yeonju fell silent. She looked at the wall more closely. She looked at the stone. At the gate. At the faint glow in the masonry that was visible even in daylight if you knew where to look. She was a mercenary, not a fool. She knew how to weigh the risks, and she could see that the wall was unlike any other she had seen in her 20 years of work. She turned to her men. She ordered them to set up camp 2 li to the south. She said she needed time to think. Doyun nodded. He climbed down from the wall. He approached Taekwon. He told him to forge faster. Taekwon asked how many there were. Doyun replied that there were 60. Taekwon spat and asked how many spikes were currently in the wall. Doyun replied that there were 14. Taegwon said that wasn't enough and went to the forge. That night, Doyun didn't sleep. He stood on the wall, watching the campfires of the mercenaries. Minsu stood beside him. She quietly asked if they would attack. Doyun replied that they would, because the Black Crane was losing its reputation for failing to fulfill a contract, and reputation is everything to mercenaries. Minsu was silent for a moment. Then she asked who had sent them. Doyun didn't answer right away. He looked south toward the capital, which lay beyond the mountains and plains, where, in a mansion on the main avenue, Marquis Sun Gi-hoon sat, moving pieces on a board. Doyun answered with a single word, Sun Gi-hoon. And he added quietly, almost to himself, he said the Marquis will yet regret not sending an army, because he would at least have respected an army, but he'll simply absorb the mercenaries into the wall. Minsu looked at him. There was no malice in his eyes. There was something colder, calculation, as precise as a formula from the atlas. Dawn was approaching. The wall awaited. Ba Yeonju attacked on the third day. Not at dawn, as expected, but at noon, when the sun blinded the defenders on the southern wall. She was a professional, and she knew her job. 20 swordsmen charged the gate, not with a battering ram, but with sheer force. 20 B and C rank fighters simultaneously channeled mana into their blades and slashed at the gate's leaves. A coordinated strike. Their combined power exceeded that of an A rank fighter. The clenched jaw seal flared so brightly that Minsu, standing on the tower, had to squint. The gate absorbed the blow. It compacted. It held. 2 swords bounced off the stone, and 4 mercenaries dropped their weapons due to the recoil in their wrists. Yeonju stood 30 paces away and watched. She wasn't surprised. She had been expecting this. The gate was a test. The real attack was coming from the east. 15 archers with mana-enhanced arrows fired a volley over the wall, not at the people, but at the foundations of the houses behind the wall. The arrows carried runes of destruction. Upon striking stone, the rune activates and shatters the rock from within. A standard tactic against fortifications. Doyun had anticipated this as well. The arrows struck the stone roofs. The runes activated. The stone did not crumble. The resonant masonry absorbed the destructive energy and redirected it through the mana grid into the walls. The walls grew stronger. The houses remained intact. Yeonju saw this, and for the first time in the battle, her expression changed. She issued her third order. The 25 remaining fighters, armed with hooks and ropes, began scaling the western wall, the lowest section. 2.5 meters. Doyun had built it first and hadn't had time to reinforce it yet. The mercenaries were fast. The first one reached the crest in 8 seconds and hung there. Runic spikes extended from the cracks. But the Black Crane's mercenaries weren't orcs. They were humans. Trained. Wearing dragon skin gloves. They slipped off the scales and failed to pierce them. 3 of them scrambled over the ridge and jumped inside. Taegwon was waiting for them below. The blacksmith stood with his hammer and had no intention of talking. He struck the first mercenary in the shield. The shield snapped in half. The mercenary was slammed into the wall. Taegwon smashed the hilt into the second mercenary's jaw, and he collapsed to the ground, not knowing where he was. The third was smarter and retreated toward the wall, and the wall took him. The stone behind the mercenary came to life, not with spikes. The surface became sticky, like resin. His hands and back stuck fast. The mercenary twitched and sank deeper. Imprinted architecture. The rune of seizure. The building itself was fighting. Doyun stood on the north wall and looked down. He didn't run toward the breach. He didn't shout orders. He stood there and counted. 3 inside, 7 on the wall, 15 at the eastern wall, 20 at the gate, -4 with their hands knocked off, 15 archers in the rear. Yeonju 30 paces from the gate. Everyone was in position. Doyun placed his palm on the stone parapet. He closed his eyes. He activated the 4th circuit. The wall hummed. A low, vibrating sound traveled through the masonry like the pulse of a giant heart. Everyone felt it. The mercenaries on the wall, the mercenaries at the gate, archers, Yeonju, everyone. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Not strongly, but enough to understand. Doyun opened his eyes and looked at Yeonju through the wall. She was standing there, listening to that sound. The sound of a wall containing 12,000 units of structural mana and 14 runic pins. A wall that had absorbed a coordinated A-rank attack and grown stronger. A wall that traps people in stone. A wall that hums. Yeonju raised her hand. Retreat. The mercenaries retreated. Quickly. Professionally. They took the wounded with them. Doyun released the three inside. The stone softened and they tumbled out onto the grass, wet and shivering. Teogwan stood over them with a hammer, smirking. Yeonju rode up to the gate. Alone. Unarmed. She raised her head. Looked at Doyun. Said that a contract is a contract. That she couldn't leave empty-handed. That the client had paid for results. Doyun replied from above. Asked how much the client had paid. Yeonju named the figure. 300 gold lien. Doyun was silent. Then he said he was offering her another contract. To guard Paesan for 3 months. 400 lien. From what funds? She asked. Doyun replied that it would come from the money he'd earned once he finished building the watermill and began grinding grain for the entire northern province. Yeonju looked up at him. At the young man in gray work clothes with a charcoal pencil tucked behind his ear. With an F-rank seal on his collarbone. The young man who had just stopped 60 mercenaries without drawing a weapon. She thought for a long time. A minute. Then she nodded. She turned her horse around and rode toward the camp. Doyun climbed down from the wall. Chang-sik was waiting below. The old man was pale but stood upright. He said that Doyun didn't have 400 riang. Doyun replied that she didn't yet. Chang-sik asked what would happen if she took the money and struck again. Doyun replied that she wouldn't. Chang-sik asked how he knew that. Doyun said he'd seen the way she looked at the wall, the way a master looks at a work he respects. People like that don't destroy what they've come to revere. Chang-sik shook his head. He said Doyun was either a genius or a madman. Doyun replied that he was most likely both. A week passed. Yeonju and the Black Crane clan set up camp by the southern road. Mercenaries patrolled the approaches. For the first time in 4 years, Paesan had external security. Doyun paid in advance, with grain, warm lodging, a promise of gold. Yeonju accepted. She was a mercenary. She understood investments. And Doyun was building. A watermill on the stream south of the village. The stream flowed down from the mountains and carried enough force to turn the millstones year-round. But Doyun didn't build the mill just anywhere. He built it on the second geomantic node. Weak, small, but sufficient. The mill became the second anchor of the mana grid. An invisible thread of structural mana stretched between the well and the mill. The grid grew. The counter grew. 14,000 units. 15. 16. Every day. Every stone. Doyun could feel Paesan awakening beneath his hands. Not a village. An organism. A living, pulsating organism made of stone and mana. And this organism was growing. News of the Black Crane's failure reached the capital 2 weeks later. Marquis Song Gi-hoon sat in his study, reading the report. 60 mercenaries. A coordinated attack. A failure. 0 casualties among the defenders. The mercenaries had defected to the enemy's side. The Marquis crumpled the report. He called for his secretary. He dictated a letter to the Council of 12 on the necessity of an imperial inspection of anomalous structures on the northern border, with wording regarding a threat to national security. Seal, signature, send. Then he summoned his second secretary, his personal secretary, and he dictated another letter, in a different language, with a different seal. The letter did not go north. The letter went east, across the border, to the twilight court of the Kwarion Empire. Marquis Song Gi-hoon sat in his dark study, staring at the map. A pin marked the location of Paesan. Small, insignificant, but it wouldn't come out, and that infuriated him. Far to the north, Doyun stood on a wall and gazed at the stars. Min-so sat next to a small wooden board. Doyun told her to write it down. 16,400 units. Architect I. Min-soo wrote it down.
She looked up. She asked what would happen next. Doyun replied that next would be an inspection, then a trial, then the troops. Min-soo asked if he was afraid. Doyun paused. Then he replied that he wasn't, because everyone who comes to his walls makes them stronger. The inspector arrived in the 6th month. He wasn't alone. Accompanying him were 12 soldiers of the Imperial Guard and one woman in a black robe of the Tower of Seals. Yoon Se-byun, the Supreme Measurer, SS rank in mana theory, the very one who personally calibrates the seals at initiation ceremonies, the very one whose word determines the rank of every mage in the Empire. She was sent to prove that Peasants' figures were a fraud, that an F-rank builder couldn't accumulate more mana within the walls than a C-rank combat mage generates in 5 years, that it was all a deception, a mistake, a forgery. Marquis Song Gi-hoon wrote to her personally, not as the head of the council, but as an old ally. He wrote that this boy with the surname Han was a threat to stability, that he must be debunked, measured, reduced to 0. He didn't write that he was afraid, but Yoon Se-byun knew how to read between the lines. 20 years at the tower teach you that better than any academy. The motorcade pulled up to the gates of Texan. The guards at the gate stopped them. Bae Yeonju stood at the entrance with her arms crossed and asked the purpose of their visit. The Imperial Inspector flushed. He was a 4th-rank official, and he was being stopped by a mercenary at the village gate. Yoon Se-byun touched his shoulder and said they would wait. She looked at the wall. She had already seen it, without even touching it, without even entering. She sensed mana the way others sense the heat of a fire, and an unearthly heat radiated from that wall. The gate opened. Doyun stepped out to meet them. Gray work clothes, a pencil tucked behind his ear, dust on his hands. He nodded to the inspector and said he was ready for the inspection. The inspector started with the documents, the allocation order, the construction license, and the fortification permit. Doyun placed the allocation order on the table. There was no license. There was no permit. An F-class builder is not authorized to erect defensive structures. That is a privilege reserved for B-class and higher. The inspector noted the violation, then a second, a third. Unlicensed hiring of security personnel, unregistered use of magic in construction, exploitation of geomantic resources without an imperial patent. 7 violations in the first hour of the inspection. Each one warranted a fine or arrest. The inspector was almost smiling. The case was simple. Shut down Pexon, arrest the builder, report back to the Marquise. Then Yoon Se-byun asked to examine the wall. The inspector waved his hand dismissively. A formality. Let the surveyor confirm that an F rank couldn't have built this, and the case would be closed. Yoon Se-byun approached the north wall. She removed her glove. Slowly, like a surgeon before an operation. She placed her palm on the stone. She froze. 2 seconds. 3. 5. She jerked her hand away, as if from a burn. She turned pale. Doyun stood 5 steps away and watched, calmly, with mild interest, as one watches an experiment that confirms a hypothesis. Yoon Se-byun turned to him. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. She said that 200 years of work by 6 masters had gone into this. That one person couldn't have done it. That it was impossible. Doyun didn't answer. He waited. Se-byun placed her palm on it again. This time she didn't pull it away. She held it there for 10 seconds. 20. She was counting. She was the best measurer on the continent, and she was counting. And the numbers didn't add up. They didn't match anything she'd seen in her 30 years working at the tower. 23,000 units of mana in the walls. 23,000. An F-rank builder in 6 months. It wasn't a scam. It was worse. It was the truth. She withdrew her hand. She turned to the inspector. She said the figures had been verified, that no anomalies had been detected. The inspector's eyes widened. He asked how that could be. 23,000 units of mana in a village wall, that wasn't an anomaly. Sebyong looked at him and replied that no, it wasn't. It's not an anomaly. It's an unknown methodology. She couldn't classify it as a violation because there was no category for structural mana in the tower's registry. The inspector opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again. He didn't understand. He had come to shut down the village, and the Empire's chief surveyor was telling him that the village was legal.
Because there were no words in the law to describe what was happening here. That evening, Yoon Sebyong-yun sat in the room she had been assigned and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Marquis Song Gi-hun. Official. Dry. No anomalies detected. Methodology unclassified. Recommendation. Continue observation. The second letter was different. Personal. To the rector of the Chongmyong Academy. 7 words. Burn all archives on Sonryeon immediately. She knew. She touched the wall and understood. The formulas in the masonry were ancient, pre-war. The very ones the tower had been burning for 500 years. The very ones said to have been destroyed forever. They were here, in the stone, alive, working, proving that the tower lies, that the seals lie, that an F rank can be higher than an SS if measured not by killing, but by creation. If this gets out, everything will collapse. The entire system, all the ranks, all the privileges, all the tower's power, all the council's power, the entire hierarchy that had stood for 1,000 years on a single simple idea. Power is how much you can burn. Yoon Sebyong sat there, staring at her hands. Hands that, for 30 years, had measured others' power on a scale that turned out to be flawed. She left that morning. The inspector left with her. The inspection report was signed. No violations were found. Formally, Baeksan is in the clear. Formally. But Doyun knew this wasn't the end. The Marquis wouldn't stop. He'll receive Sebyong's report. He'll read between the lines. He'll realize that the measurer found something and got scared. And he'll go further. Higher. Harsher. Doyun stood on the wall and watched the motorcade drive off toward the south. Taegwon approached. He stood beside him. He asked what the witch from the tower had said. Doyun replied that she'd said it was impossible. Taegwon snorted and asked, "But what did she really say?" Doyun replied that, in fact, she'd told the truth. It's impossible. On their scale. Taegwon paused and asked, "And on our scale?" For the first time that day, Doyun smiled. Barely noticeable. Just the corner of his mouth. He replied that, on our scale, he had only just begun. The blow came from a face Doyun hadn't expected. Sun Ji-hwa, 22 years old, and rank. Ice blade like his father. Yuri's older brother.
He didn't come with the army. He came alone. On horseback. In the white armor of the Sun clan, with the crest on his breastplate. Handsome. Young. Angry. He didn't know about his father's schemes, didn't know about the puppet officials, didn't know about the spies. He didn't know about the letters to the Twilight Court. He knew one thing. Somewhere up north, his sister's former fiancé, an F rank, was somehow dishonoring the Sun family name. Scouts are reporting, officials are whispering. The tower measurer has returned, pale and silent. And this builder sits in his village, pretending he's equal to those born with true power. Chi-hwa dismounted at the gate. Yeonju's guards blocked his path. Chi-hwa looked down at the mercenary and said that he was the son of Marquis Sun Gi-hun and heir to the Sun clan. Yeonju didn't budge. She looked at the wall. Doyun stood above. He nodded. Yeonju stepped aside. The gate opened. Chi-hwa entered. He looked around. He had expected mud and shacks. Instead, he saw clean cobblestone streets, stone houses, a functioning hospital, a school where Min Soo was teaching children to count, a mill on the stream. people who weren't starving or freezing.
8 months ago, this had been a wasteland with 4 dozens of beggars. Now more than 1,000 people lived here, and all were well fed. Jihua walked down the main street. The residents looked at his white armor and turned away, not out of fear, with indifference. They saw the A rank on his seal, and they didn't care. It wasn't his rank that protected them. It was the walls that protected them. Doyun met him in the square by the well. Jihua stopped 3 steps away. He looked at the F-class seal. Dull. Blue-gray. A beggar's lantern. Jihua said he was challenging him. An official duel. According to the Academy's code, his right as a noble against a lower rank. If Doyun lost, he would leave Peksan and all the northern lands forever. If he won, Jihua smirked. An F rank cannot defeat an A rank. It's physics. Doyun looked at him calmly. He replied that he accepted, but on his own terms. Not a fight. Siege drills. Paragraph 47 of the Academy Code. The defending side builds fortifications. The attacking side destroys them. The winner is whoever's structure or skill proves stronger. Jihua frowned. He'd been expecting a direct duel. Sword against nothing. Victory in 3 seconds. But paragraph 47 did indeed exist. Doyun knew the code by heart. He'd written a term paper based on it. Jihua couldn't refuse without losing face. He agreed. The terms. Doyun builds a wall. Jihua demolishes it. 48 hours total. If the wall is still standing after 48 hours, Doyun wins. If it falls, Jihua wins. Doyun chose the location, a flat area east of Peksan. No geomantic nodes, no advantages. Bare stone on bare earth. He wanted it to be fair, so that no one could say he'd cheated. Taegwon asked him why he'd given up the node. It's foolish. Doyun replied that he didn't need a node to prove his point. All he needed was the formula and a stone. Taegwon shook his head and said he was definitely crazy. Doyun began building. Minsu did the calculations. Taegwon forged the pins. Yeonju and her people carried the stone. Changsik stood and watched. The residents of Peksan stood and watched. Word spread throughout the region. By evening on the first day, people from 5 neighboring villages had gathered at the eastern field. By morning on the second day, there were 10. 3 border lords arrived. The captain of the nearest garrison arrived. Scout No Soo-jin, who couldn't miss such an event, arrived. General Park Moon-ho did not come, but he sent an aide-de-camp with orders to record everything. Doyun worked for 48 hours, without a break, without sleep, without food. That was his limit. A large-scale construction project requires uninterrupted concentration. If he were interrupted at the wrong moment, the mana grid would collapse and everything would come crashing down. Minsu didn't leave his side. She counted the blocks. She kept track of the time. She counted the units of mana he wove into each stone. After 20 hours, his hands were shaking from exhaustion. After 30, blood was dripping from under his fingernails. After 40 hours, he couldn't feel his fingers. But every stone was set precisely. Every formula was woven in without error. After 48 hours, the wall stood. 3 meters high, 10 meters long, 1 meter thick. Gray stone with a barely noticeable blue glow in the joints. Without Taegwon's pins, without knots, pure resonant masonry. 10,000 units of structural mana invested over 2 days. Doyun took 3 steps back. He could barely stand. Minsu took him by the arm. He pushed her away, gently but firmly. He stood on his own, turned to Jihua, nodded. Your move. Jihua stepped onto the field. A rank, Ice Blade, son of the Marquis. He was certain, absolutely certain. A 3-meter-high wall without a foundation in an open field. He'd been breaking walls like that with a single blow since he was 12. Jihua raised his sword. Mana surged through the blade. Ice formed along the edge and swirled like a whirlwind. A-rank technique, Icy Rift. He struck. The blade slammed into the stone. Sparks, a crack, a flash of blue. The wall absorbed the blow. The stone didn't crack. It didn't budge. It absorbed the impact and grew denser. The crowd gasped. Jiwa struck again, harder, with both hands. He poured all his mana into the blade. An icy vortex swirled 3 meters around the point of impact. The temperature dropped to -40. The stone was covered in frost. The frost crumbled away. The stone beneath it was intact, warm, alive. The wall returned some of the energy as a wave of cold air. Jika was knocked back 2 meters. He stayed on his feet. He looked at the wall. He looked at his sword. There was a crack in the blade. The wall had broken his sword. The crowd was silent. No gasps, just silence. Silence is worse than a scream. Jiwa struck for another 4 hours. Icy rift, icy spear, icy storm. A-rank techniques, one after another. The wall absorbed the blows. It glowed. It hummed. With every strike, it grew stronger. Doyun stood 10 meters away and said nothing. Minsu recorded everything. Every strike, every absorption, every number. After 4 hours, Jiwa fell to his knees. His mana was depleted. His hands were bloodied from the hilt. 2 broken swords lay in the grass. The wall stood, without a single crack. Doyun approached, not Jiwa, the wall. He placed his palm against it, closed his eyes, counted, turned to Minsu. He told her to write it down. 18,400 from the initial 10,000. The A-rank techniques had yielded an increase of 8,400 units in 4 hours. Good efficiency. Jiwa heard him. He raised his head. He looked at Doyun. Not with rage, with something else. This F-rank builder had just assessed him, as material, as stone, as mortar, and found the output to be good. The crowd stirred. One of the border lords whispered to his neighbor quietly, but everyone heard. He said that the F-rank had just smashed an A-ranker against the wall he'd built in 2 days with his bare hands, and added that he didn't give a damn what the tower said. This isn't an F. Jiwa stood up, silently. He picked up the shards of his sword. He walked over to Doyun, stood face to face with him, stared at him for a long time. Then he said 3 words. He said he'd lost fair and square. He turned around. He mounted his horse. He rode away. But Doyun saw his eyes. There was no hatred in them. There was a question. The very same question Jihua would ask his father when he returned. A question to which the Marquis had no honest answer. Rumors traveled faster than any courier. A week after the duel, every innkeeper from the northern border to the central provinces, an F-rank who had shattered the wall of the A-rank heir to the Sun clan, a builder who fed 1,000 people where the capital fed only worms, a village that neither orcs nor mercenaries nor nobles could take. People were now flocking to Pexon not by the dozens, but by the hundreds. Families from burned-down villages, artisans squeezed out by the capital's guilds, veterans forgotten by the crown, herbalists, carpenters, mason, scribes, all those whom the system called earthbound, all those whose seals glowed dimly or not at all. They were heading toward the man with the faintest seal on the continent because he was building what no one else was building. By the 9th month, 4,000 souls lived in Pexon. The village had ceased to be a village. Doyun was rebuilding it into a township, a second wall, an outer ring 3 li in diameter, residential quarters, workshops, a market, a second well at the 3rd geomantic node, which Doyun had found 2 li to the north. The mana grid was expanding. 3 anchors, 3 nodes, 3 threads connecting them, a triangle, a stable structure. Inside the triangle, mana circulated on its own, without Doyun's intervention. The walls within the perimeter were restored overnight. Cracks were healing. The stone was being renewed. The city was breathing. 41,000 units. Architect 3. Minsu kept 3 journals. The first was for herself. Formulas, calculations, theory. She had already read the first 50 pages of the atlas and understood every one of them. The second was for Doyun, a daily report on the mana grid, flows, Nodes, growth, anomalies. She kept the third journal in secret. Doyun didn't know about it. This journal contained figures she had gathered from Yeonju's intelligence reports. Figures from the capital, the budgets of the Council of 12, Marquis Song Gi-hoon's expenditures, the Tower of Seal's revenues. Minsu calculated. She calculated as naturally as she breathed, automatically, continuously. And the numbers formed a picture that she had not yet shown to anyone. In the 10th month, the first imperial official arrived, not to shut down Baeksan, but to observe. Lord Kim Hyun-sik, governor of the central province of Chungwon, S rank, 50 years old, a quiet man with a reputation as an honest administrator, a rarity in an empire where honesty doesn't advance one's career. He had come because his province was losing its people. Artisans were heading north, peasants were heading north, everyone was going to Baeksan. Kim Hyun-sik wanted to understand why. Doyun gave him a tour of the township. He showed him the walls, the mill, the hypocaust, the hospital, the school, the sewer system, the storage facilities. Lord Kim walked in silence. He looked around. He touched the walls. He felt the stone. He didn't sense mana like General Park or the measurer Sabyeon. He sensed something else. Order. A system. A functioning infrastructure that didn't exist in any city in his province. That didn't exist in any city in the empire except the capital. And which stood here in a former village of 400 souls, built by a single man in 10 months. Lord Kim sat down in the council chamber across from Doyun and asked directly what he wanted. Doyun replied that recognition. Official protected settlement status for Baeksan. This means the crown cannot requisition the structures, cannot recall the builder, and cannot disband the settlement. By law, protected settlement status is granted to a territory that has withstood 3 documented attacks. Doyun placed 3 reports on the table: an Orok raid, an attack by the Black Crane, a duel with Sun Jihua, which formally qualifies as a defense capability test. 3 attacks, 3 repels, 0 casualties. Lord Kim read them. He looked up. He asked who would sign. Doyun replied that General Park Moon-ho had already signed. Lord Kim looked at the general's signature. Heavy, forceful. The signature of a man who, in the north, carries more weight than the Council of 12. Lord Kim took out his seal. He affixed it. Baeksan was granted protected status, officially, legally, and Marquis Song Gi-hoon could no longer revoke it with a single stroke of his pen. The news reached the capital within a week. The Marquis learned of it that evening at dinner. His secretary reported it between courses. The Marquis did not slam his fist on the table. He did not shout. He carefully set down his chopsticks. He moistened his lips. And he left the table. An hour later, the light was on in his study. 2 hours later, he summoned the commander of his personal guard. 3 hours later, he sent a 4th letter to the Twilight Court. This letter was different. Not a request. Not a negotiation. A proposal. A concrete one. With dates. With routes. With an indication of the weak points on the northern border. Marquis Song Gi-hoon, whose son had just lost a duel, was publicly proposing to the Empire's enemy that they strike through the northern pass, right where the 3 crown fortresses stood, the very ones he, as head of the Council of 12, had underfunded for the past 4 years. Right where the garrisons were only 1/3 manned. Right where the walls were thin and the foundations rotten. The Marquis had no intention of destroying Baeksan. The Marquis intended to destroy everything around Baeksan. And when the north falls, and thousands perish and the enemy stands at the capital's walls, when panic engulfs the court and the king loses his head, then the Marquis will offer peace. On his own terms. And he will claim the crown. As for Baeksan, Baeksan will simply drown in the tide. What difference does it make how much mana is in the walls if all around there's nothing but ashes and corpses, and no one to haul grain, no one to trade with, and nowhere to turn for help? The Marquis sealed the letter. He put it away in a box. He summoned a courier. Far to the north, Doyun stood on the new outer wall and watched at the sunset. Taegwon was forging below. the rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil. Minsu sat on the steps and wrote in her third journal. Yeonju was checking the guard posts.
Chang-sik was talking to the new refugees at the gate.
4,000 people lived within the walls, and for the first time in a long while, none of them feared tomorrow. Doyun was thinking about the Marquis, the man who had ruined his life 3 years ago and was now trying to ruin it again. The summons didn't work. The mercenaries didn't work. The inspection didn't work. His son didn't work. What next? Doyun knew. The Marquis wouldn't stop. People like Song Gi-hoon don't stop. They escalate. They raise the stakes until they win or until they fall. And for the Marquis to fall, he needs a stage. A public one. A big one. One that the entire council can see. One that the king can see. Doyun ran his fingers over the stone of the wall. Warm. Alive. 41,000 units. The city planner stands in the doorway. He needs time. A few more months. And then... Doyun quietly uttered the Marquis's name. Not with rage. With the patience of a mason who knows that the mortar must set before laying the next block. Son Yuri wrote her first letter 3 months after the ceremony. Doyun found it in a bundle brought a merchant from the central province had brought. The paper was expensive. The handwriting was neat. The Sun clan's seal was in the corner. He didn't open it. He placed it on a shelf in his study. The second letter arrived 5 months later. The third, 7 months later. By the 11th month, there were 8 letters on the shelf, sealed, untouched. The stack grew like a small wall. Minsu saw them every day. She cleaned Doyun's room once a week because he forgot. She saw the stack. She counted them. 8. Once, she asked why he didn't read them. Doyun replied that he was busy. Minsu looked at him the way only she knew how to look, straight on, without deference, without fear. With the gaze of a 17-year-old girl who had survived the destruction of her village and feared nothing anymore. She said he was lying, that he wasn't busy, he was afraid. Doyun fell silent. He set his pencil on the table. He looked at the stack. 8 letters. 8 times Yuri had reached out to him across the distance, the silence, and time. He said he wasn't afraid. He said that if he read them, he'd start thinking about her. And if he started thinking about her, he'd stop thinking about the wall. And the wall was more important right now than anything Yuri could write on expensive paper. Minsu nodded. She didn't ask any more questions, but the letters kept coming. The 9th. A month later, the 10th. The 11th month. Paesan was alive, growing, breathing. The population had surpassed 6,000. Doyun was building the 3rd line of walls, an outer ring that encompassed not only the village, but also the surrounding fields. Crop fields lay within the perimeter. Paesan was no longer dependent on external grain supplies. The geomantic connection to the node accelerated growth. The wheat grew 1.5 times faster. The harvest was twice as large as usual. Peasants from neighboring villages came to look at Paesan's fields and shook their heads in amazement. The grain grew uniform, golden and plump, just like in the fairy tales of the Sonryeon era. Doyun had risen to the rank of City Builder 1. 52,000 units of structural mana, 3 rings of walls, 5 geomantic nodes, a mill, Tagwan's forge, which now occupied an entire block, a hospital with 100 beds, a school where Minsu taught 20 students the basics of geometry and arithmetic, a trading courtyard where border lords exchanged Paesan's grain for iron and timber. And every stone in every building was part of the grid. Every wall breathed mana. Every roof shed snow. Every foundation stood anchored to a node. A city that, on paper, was a village. A fortress that, according to the records, was a farm building. Doyun worked. Every day. From dawn until midnight. Tagwan forged. Yeonju trained the militia of former veterans whom Chang-sik had found through his network. Minsu calculated, studied, and calculated again. The 12th month. Winter had returned. Doyun's second northern season. But this winter was different. It wasn't quiet. Villages were burning in the west. The orcs were marching south again. Not 40 like last year. Hundreds. The tribes were uniting. Someone was leading them. Someone clever. Someone who understood strategy, not just brute force. Yeonju's intelligence brought back a name. Grahul, the chieftain of chieftains. An A rank by human standards. He had united 6 tribes into a single army. 800 orcs and 4 battering rams. 2 shamans with siege-class spells. They marched along the border, burning everything that didn't manage to flee. 3 villages in a week, 4 in 2. Refugees poured into Pekson by the hundreds. Every day, new faces at the gates. Women carrying children in their arms. Old people who had walked for 3 days without food. Wounded soldiers from defeated garrisons. Doyun took them all in. The walls expanded. The houses grew. Mana flowed. By the end of the 12th month, there were 10,000 souls in Pekson. 10,000 people behind the walls built by an F-rank builder. Grahul learned of Pekson. He couldn't help but find out. The only spot on the northern map that wasn't burning. The only wall still standing. He sent out a reconnaissance party, 10 orcs. They approached within a li and a half of the walls and stood there for a day. They watched. Then they left. 3 days later, an ultimatum arrived. An orc envoy. Huge, unarmed, with a white rag on his spear. He growled Grahul's message at the gates. Grahul proposed a deal. Pekson would open the gates. He'd hand over the grain. He'd hand over the iron. Grahul would pass by and leave the people unharmed. If he refused, Grahul would come himself, with all 800 of them. Doyun stood on the wall and listened. Then he replied with a single sentence. He said that his walls thrived on blows and that he'd be happy to have a good dinner. The envoy left. Yeonju stood nearby, shaking her head. She said he'd lost his mind. That 800 orcs weren't the same as 40. That an A-rank chieftain wasn't the same as a C-rank one. That an army was needed here, not a wall. Doyun replied that the army wouldn't come. The capital won't send troops to the north. Not now. Not to him. Marquis Song Gi-hoon will make sure of that, and the wall will hold. Yeonju asked how he knew. Doyun placed his palm on the stone parapet. 52,000 units. 5 nodes, 3 rings. Resonant masonry along the entire perimeter. Seals on every gate. Runic pins every 3 meters. An underground mana grid that connects every stone into a single organism. He said he knew because he had built this wall for this very day. Every stone, every formula, every pin. He wasn't building a village. He was building a trap, and Grahul would walk right into it. Yeonju looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled. For the first time ever, without cynicism. She turned around and went to prepare the people. Grahul arrived 5 days later. 800 orcs, 4 battering rams, 2 shamans. The ground shook beneath their footsteps. Doyun stood on the gate wall, a pencil behind his ear, hands behind his back. 10,000 men outside his walls. 10,000 lives that depended on stone, a formula, and calculation. His counter read 56,000 units. Grahul raised his axe. The horde roared and struck. The first battering ram struck the southern gate, and the ground shook so violently that plaster rained down from the houses behind the wall. It was no ordinary log. It was a stone pillar bound with chains inscribed with runes of destruction that the shamans had burned along its entire length. The seal of the clenched jaw flared. It absorbed. It compressed. But the second battering ram struck the eastern gate at the same time. A third struck the western gate. Grahul was no Urgath. He didn't strike a single point. He struck 3. He stretched the mana grid. He forced the resonant masonry to distribute energy along the entire perimeter instead of concentrating it in one place. Doyun stood on the southern wall and sensed it. The grid was vibrating. Not critically, but tensely, like a string being pulled from 3 sides. He closed his eyes and redirected the flows. The southern gate received 40%. The eastern gate, 30%. The western gate, 30%. The southern battering ram was the heaviest. Grahul was standing right there. The second blow. The third. The fourth. Each one carried runes of destruction. Each one carried the dark mana of the shamans. Ordinary resonant masonry would have absorbed this as well. But the shamans were clever. They weren't trying to break the stone. They were trying to poison it. The dark mana seeped into the masonry like poison into the blood. Doyun felt it on the 100th blow, a taste of rot in the stone. The runes of destruction weren't breaking the wall. They were corroding the bonds between the blocks, weakening the resonance, making the stone dead. He opened his eyes. He looked at Minsu. He told her that the shamans were poisoning the masonry, that he needed 3 minutes. Minsu nodded and ran to Taguan. Doyun knelt down. He pressed both palms against the stone wall, and he did something he hadn't done once since arriving in Peksan. He channeled his own mana into the wall. Not structural mana, personal mana. That tiny drop of F-rank reserve that burned within him with a dim blue-gray light. A drop that the tower had deemed useless. This drop traveled through the mana grid like an impulse through nerves. It didn't burn the dark mana. It recoded it. Structural mana, based on Sonrion's formulas, could do one thing that combat mana could not. It transformed the foreign into its own. The shaman's dark mana became part of the wall. The stone shuddered. It turned blue. It grew warm. The connections were restored. The resonance returned. And the counter jumped 4,000 units in 3 seconds. 60,000. Doyun stood up. Taguan was already running along the wall with a hammer. Behind him were 4 of Changsik's veterans with long spears. Yeonju was leading 20 mercenaries toward the eastern gate, where the orcs were already scaling the rampart. The battle lasted 12 hours. Not 7 minutes like with Urgot. 2 teen hours of relentless pressure. Grahul changed tactics every hour. Battering rams, ladders, grappling hooks. A tunnel dug from the southwest that came to a halt when the ground beneath the orcs' shovels turned to stone. A geomantic foundation. Doyun had woven protection even into the soil. The shamans tried 3 times to poison the masonry. 3 times, Doyun recoded their mana. Each time, the wall grew stronger. By the 6th hour, the orcs had lost 100. By the 9th, 200. The walls were red with their blood and blue with mana. Runic spikes. The seal of seizure. The formula of return. The wall fought on its own. Doyun walked along the perimeter and controlled the flows. He redirected energy to where the pressure was mounting. He sealed breaches that didn't exist because there were no breaches. Not a single one. In 12 hours, an A-rank chieftain with 800 fighters and 2 shamans failed to punch a single hole in the wall. Grahul realized this by the 10th hour. He stood before the southern gate, covered in blood, his own and others. His best warriors lay at the foot of the walls. His battering rams were reduced to splinters. His shamans sat on the ground with empty eyes. Their mana had run dry, and the wall still stood. And it glowed. Brighter than it had in the morning. Grahul did something he had never done in his life. He retreated. He didn't run like those 40 had after Urgot's death. He retreated in an orderly fashion. He gathered the wounded. He gathered the dead. He headed north. 600 orcs out of 800. 200 remained at the walls. Doyun stood atop the wall and watched them leave. Taguan stood beside him, covered in the blood of others. A hammer in his hand, a smirk on his face. He said it wasn't bad for an F rank. Doyun didn't reply. He was calculating. 78,000 units of structural mana, a gain of 22,000 over 12 hours of battle. An A-rank chieftain and 2 shamans had been feeding his walls for half a day. City builder 2, almost 3. Minsu approached from below, pale. Her hands were covered in ink. She had been recording every minute of the battle, every strike, every absorption, every number. 3 logs full of data. She looked up and said there had been outside observers. Doyun asked how many. Minsu replied that there were 2. One from the hill to the south, Scout No Sujin. The second from the pass to the east, a rider in white armor. Doyun froze. White armor. The Sun Clan. Jiwa. The Marquis's son had returned. Not to attack, to observe. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Doyun looked east. The horsemen had already left. But he had been here. He had seen it. How 800 orcs had pounded against the wall for half a day and left empty-handed. How an F rank had commanded the defense without drawing a weapon. How the wall had absorbed the blows and grown. Jiwa had seen, and now he had more than just questions for his father. Now he had answers his father didn't want to give. Doyun climbed down from the wall. He walked past the hospital where the wounded lay. 17 people, all veterans of Changshik and mercenaries from Yeonju. Not a single resident. The wall had protected them. The wall had always protected them. He reached his study, sat down at the desk, looked at the stack of letters. 11, unopened. He picked up the top one, turned it over in his hands, put it back. Not now. He picked up a pencil, unfolded the map. Not of Peksan, of the continent. 57 points. The nodes of the ancient Sonryeon monogrid. He marked the ones he'd found around Peksan. 5 out of 57. A drop in the bucket. But the map revealed a pattern. The nodes weren't random. They formed a grid. Like a nervous system. The spinal column ran from north to south across the entire continent. Lateral lines branched off from it. Every city of the Sonryeon era stood at an intersection. Every fortress was a node. Every road was a nerve. 1,000 years ago, all of Haryeon was a single living organism. And the Tower of Seals killed it. Slowly, methodically, century after century. It forced people to burn instead of build. It severed the nerves. It extinguished the hubs. It turned a living continent into a dead land. Doyun looked at the map and, for the first time, grasped the scale of it all. He thought he was seeking revenge, that he was building a refuge, that he was proving an F rank could be stronger than an A. But it was more than that, much more. He wasn't building a city. He was reigniting the network. The 13th month. Peksan ceased to be a district and became a mark. Not by decree of the capital, by fact. 14,000 souls, 6 quarters, 3 rings of walls, an outer wall 12 li in diameter, 6 towers along the perimeter, moats laid out along geomantic nodes, 9 nodes activated. The mana grid covered the territory like a dense web, and every stone within it pulsed blue when a hand was placed upon it. 100,000 units of structural mana. City Builder 3. Doyun was no longer building alone. Min-so led a team of 12 apprentices, young, refugees, all non-combat classes, herbalists, scribes, 1 former cook. Min-su taught them the formulas from the atlas, the first 10 pages, basic resonant masonry, node anchoring, and the simplest seals. They built more slowly than Doyun, more crudely, but they were building. For the first time in 1,000 years, someone other than a single man was weaving mana into stone using Sonryeon's formulas. Doyun watched them and realized that this was more important than any wall. A wall is stone. A school is the future. Teoguan expanded the forge to cover an entire block. 8 apprentices. Rune steel poured from his furnaces every day. Pins, fasteners, gate hinges, grates for gutters, all with runes woven into them, all part of the network. Yeonju had built the militia up to 300 men, non-combat mages, Chang-6 veterans, former peasants, mercenaries from the clan. But they stood on the walls and knew that the walls protected them. This gave them something no rank could provide. Chang-6 commanded the inner guard. 62 years old, his left arm still unbent, his voice like a trumpet, and every recruit would stand at attention when the old man passed by. Baeksan was alive, and the capital had finally taken notice. Not a marquis, a king. His Majesty Che Taejong, father of Crown Prince Che Gon-ho. An A+ rank. 61 years on the throne. A quiet man, not weak. Quiet. He ruled not with an iron fist, but with silence. He remained silent when the Council of 12 slashed the budget for the North. He remained silent when Marquis Song Gi-hun pushed through his own people. He remained silent when villages burned. The king remained silent because he knew. He knew everything. He knew about the Marquis's mercenaries, about the underfunding of the fortresses, about the letters to the east. The king had his own intelligence service, and it had been operating for 30 years. But knowing and acting are two different things. To act against Marquis Song Gi-hoon meant dismantling the Council of 12. It meant civil war. It meant bloodshed. The king waited. He waited for the moment when the Marquis would make a mistake big enough for the council itself to turn him in. And that moment was drawing near. The king's intelligence reported on Pekson in the 10th month. It reported on Jihua's duel, on the flight of Grahul's horde, on the 14,000 souls beyond the walls, on numbers that defied all scales. The king read the report. He was silent, and he continued to wait. In the 14th month, the twilight court struck. Not immediately at Pekson, across the entire north. 4 legions, 16,000 soldiers, 2 A-rank commanders, 1 SS-rank Reaper. The Reaper's name spread along the border like a plague. Khan Mudon, the man who burned 3 fortresses with a single spell in a war 20 years ago. He had returned. The legions struck through the northern pass, exactly where the Marquis had indicated in his letters, exactly where the fortresses were empty. The first crown fortress fell in 2 days, a garrison of 300 men, walls 5 cubits thick. Kang Mudon did not destroy them. He walked right through them. SS-class technology from the Dead Pass. The wall does not break. The wall dies. The stone loses its structure. It turns to dust. The Reaper strides through the dust, and his legion follows. The second fortress fell 3 days later. The third 2 days later. 8 days. 3 fortresses. 2,000 dead. The northern line of defense ceased to exist. General Park Moon-ho retreated while fighting. His northern army was at 1/3 strength. He fought for every li. He lost men. He lost ground. He held on to one thing: the road to Pekson. Because Pekson was the last point in the north that still stood, refugees poured in like a flood. Not by the hundreds, by the thousands. Villages, small towns, entire garrisons. Everyone was heading for the only walls that hadn't fallen. Doyun opened the gates. He took them all in. 14,000 became 18,000, then 20,000. He built, 20 hours a day. Minsu and the students built. Taegwon forged. Yeonju stationed people along the walls. Changsik fed and housed the refugees. The city grew like a living organism. New walls rose in days rather than weeks. The mana grid was so saturated that the stones settled into place on their own. Doyun could feel it. The city wanted to grow. The city reached out to him. It responded to his touch. 130,000 units. A city builder 3 and counting. On the threshold of a new tier. Kang Muryeon reached Pekson on the 12th day. He stopped 5 li away. He looked at the walls. He looked for a long time. He raised his hand. The technique of the dead passage. A gray beam struck the southern wall. The stone trembled. For an instant. A single instant in which Doyun held his breath. Then the wall absorbed it. Not merely swallowed it. Absorbed it. Just as the earth absorbs water. The SS rank technique sank into the stone and dissolved into the mana grid. The wall did not die. The wall did not turn to dust. The wall remained stone. Kang Muryeon lowered his hand. For the first time in 20 years, his technique had failed. He struck again, and again. 3 days. For 3 days, the SS-ranked Reaper struck the walls of Pekson. The walls stood. They glowed blue. They hummed. They grew. 150,000 units. 160. 170. Every blow from the Reaper fed the city. Kang Muryeon understood this. On the 3rd day, he withdrew. The Legion set up camp. A siege. A long one. A patient one. If the wall cannot be broken, those behind it must be starved out. But inside the walls was a year's worth of grain, water from a geomantic well, heated floors, a hospital, 24,000 people who weren't starving. The siege wasn't working. The Reaper waited. Doyun waited. And both knew that the solution would not come from here. The solution would come from the capital. The capital trembled. 3 crown fortresses, 2,000 dead. The northern line of defense had been wiped out. The legions of the Twilight Court were a 16-day march from the capital's walls. King Cho Taejong convened an emergency council of 12. The throne room. That very same marble. Those very same columns with their shoddy masonry. 16 months ago, they had laughed at the F-rank boy right here. Now this was no time for laughter. Marquis Song Gi-hoon stood up first. His voice was steady. His face was stony. He proposed withdrawing the troops to the south, surrendering the north as a buffer, regrouping behind the Chungang River, fortifying the capital, buying time. Logical, reasonable, exactly what he had planned. Surrendering to the enemy the territory he himself had weakened, creating chaos. And in the chaos, seize power. The council remained silent. The 11 lords stared at the table. They knew the north could not be defended. They knew the Marquis was right about the numbers. They did not know the numbers had been rigged. Then a man whom no one expected rose in the throne room. General Park Moon-ho. Dirty, covered in road dust. He had ridden for 3 days straight from the northern front. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He had come to say one thing. He said there was one place in the north that had not fallen, Peksan. He said that Master Han was taking in refugees and that he had 24,000 souls behind his walls. He said that the Reaper of Twilight had been pounding the walls for 3 days, and the wall was still intact. The council stirred. Someone exchanged glances. The Marquis was the first to laugh. Loudly, defiantly. He said it was just a little village, against a legion, and he shook his head. 3 lords laughed with him. The rest did not. The king did not laugh. The king looked at the general. He looked at the Marquis, and he said one word. "Let's go." The procession was assembled in 2 hours. The king, the Council of 12, Crown Prince Choi Gonho in ceremonial armor that had never seen battle, Marquis Song Gi-hoon, who could not refuse without arousing suspicion, Yoon Se-byeon, the supreme measurer, who had remained silent ever since returning from Peksan 8 months ago, and Yuri, Song Yuri, in the Crown Prince's retinue, as a lady-in-waiting. She had asked to come herself. The prince had no objection. He didn't care either way. He rode with the expression of a man who was about to see something he did not want to see. The journey north took 10 days. With each passing day, the landscape changed. The green fields of the central provinces gave way to scorched earth, burned-out villages, abandoned garrisons, corpses on the roadside with no one to bury them. The council looked out the carriage windows and remained silent. The Marquis did not look. He knew what he would see. He had planned it. On the 11th day, the procession reached the last hill before Peksan, and it stopped. Before them stood not a village, not a township, not a margraviate. Before them stood a city. A ring of walls 12 li wide. 6 towers with blue lights at their tops. Moats in which water flowed against the natural terrain because geomantic nodes moved it according to their own laws. Paved roads led to 4 gates from the 4 cardinal directions. Smoke from chimneys. Light in the windows. The sounds of life beyond the walls. 24,000 people. And standing on the gate wall was Han Doyun. Not in armor. In gray work clothes. With a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear, with an F-rank seal on her collarbone that glowed with a dim blue-gray light. A beggar's lantern. The guard at the gate stepped forward. Bae Yeonju, in light armor, a sword at her belt. Behind her were 4 Changshik veterans with spears. She looked at the royal procession, at the banners, at the coats of arms, and she asked in an even voice, "What is the purpose of your visit, guests?" Crown Prince Choi Gon-ho heard the word guests and turned pale. 16 months ago, he had told Doyun that it was unbecoming for a girl of Yuri's bloodline to shiver alongside a barn repairman. Now the barn repairman stood on a wall that the SS-ranked Reaper had breached. And the prince stood below, and they called him a guest. The king introduced himself. Doyun nodded from above. The gates opened. Slowly. Smoothly. By Doyun's decree, not by the right of the crown. The motorcade entered. Clean, cobblestone streets. Stone houses with heated floors, a hospital, a school, the blacksmith's quarter, from which came the rhythmic clanging of hammers, the market square, warehouses, people on the streets, well-fed, well-dressed, alive. They bowed, but not to the king, to Doyun. They bowed to the man who had built them a home that neither an orc, nor a reaper, nor the abyss itself could enter. Yuri walked in the retinue and watched. For the first time in 16 months, she saw Doyun. He had changed. Not on the outside. Outwardly, he was the same. Thin, dusty, with a pencil behind his ear. But there was something in his posture, in the way he turned his head, in the way he walked through his city, and every stone beneath his feet responded with a faint blue glow. She understood. Not with her mind, with something deeper. She understood who she had let go. Doyun walked past her. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He walked past as if it were a blueprint that no longer interested him. Yuri lowered her eyes.
Her hands clenched into fists, her nails dug into her palms. The main council hall of Pexon was the last to be built. Doyun built it over 3 consecutive nights, not because he was in a hurry, but because he knew. He knew that one day, this hall would be filled with people upon whom the continent's fate depended. And the hall must speak for him before he even opens his mouth. Stone walls, a ceiling 4 human heights high. No carvings, no gilding, no ornamentation. Bare granite, polished, warm, pulsating. Every block laid according to the Sonrion formula, every joint woven into the mana grid. The hall was not a room. The hall was a weapon, and Doyun was going to prove it. A long granite table, no raised platforms, no thrones. Everyone sat at the same level. King Chetejong noticed this when he entered. He paused at the threshold. He looked at the stone benches, all identical, for the king and for the village elder, for the marquis and for the blacksmith. The king nodded to himself and sat down, silently, without comment. But he had noticed. The council had taken their seats, 11 lords. General Park to the king's right, Crown Prince Chegon-ho at the far end, Yoon Se-byeon, the supreme measurer, by the wall behind the king. Marquis Song Gi-hoon sat across from Doyun, directly across. Between them lay 2 meters of granite table. The Marquis rested his hands on the stone. Calmly, SS rank mana flowed through his fingers like an icy stream. He was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. 30 years on the Council of 12. 20 years at its head. He had survived 3 conspiracies. 2 kings. 1 war. A boy with F-rank mana did not inspire fear in him. It inspired irritation. Like an insect that refuses to die no matter how hard you crush it. Yuri sat against the wall among the Crown Prince's ladies-in-waiting. Silent. Hands on her knees. Fingers clasped. She looked at Doyun and didn't recognize him. Same height, same hands, same pencil behind his ear, but something was different. Something in the way he stood, the way he occupied the space, the way the stone around him responded to his every step with a faint glow. The Doyun she knew was a quiet boy with good grades and soft palms. The Doyun standing before the council was something else entirely. Yoon Se-byeon stood against the wall, trying not to move. She could sense mana. She always could. It was her gift, her curse. For 30 years at the Tower of Seals, she had measured others' power, battle mana, active emissions, reserves. She calibrated the seals at initiation ceremonies. She determined ranks. Her word made people F-class or SS class. Her word decided fates. And now she stood in a room that pulsed with mana so thick it made her ears ring. Mana was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the ceiling, in the table, in the benches, even in the air. It flowed through the mana grid like blood through veins. Quiet, steady, deafening. Se-byeon was counting. She couldn't help but count. The numbers added up in her head automatically, and each new number was worse than the last. 200,000 units in the hall's walls. No, 250. No. She counted again. She pressed her palm against the wall behind her. She shuddered. 300,000. 300,000 units of structural mana in a single hall. Just one. That was more than the entire mana reserve of the capital citadel. More than the annual budget of the Tower of Seals. More than the 3 crown fortresses that had just fallen combined.
In a single hall, built by a single person, with an F rank. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them against her thighs and clutched the fabric of her robe. Doyun stood up, unhurriedly, a pencil in his left hand. With his right, he placed the first document on the table. A map. A large one, spanning the entire table. The continent of Carrion, from the southern seas to the northern abyss. 57 points marked in red ink. Nodes. Ancient intersections of mana streams. The lines between them formed a web. A nervous system. A spinal column running from north to south. Lateral branches extending to the coasts. Rings surrounding major cities. The council looked at the map. The lords exchanged glances. Some frowned. Others shrugged. They didn't understand. To them, these were just dots on paper. The king looked. The king remained silent for a long time. His gaze swept over the lines, over the nodes. He leaned forward and touched a dot in the center of the map with his finger, a dot that coincided with the location of the ancient capital of the Sonrion era, the one mentioned in the old chronicles, which had been forgotten. The king looked at Doyun. Doyun looked at the king. Their gazes met, and in that meeting there was recognition. The king was beginning to understand. Then Doyun placed a second document on the table. 3 thin sheets, ordinary paper. Not expensive, cheap ink. But the contents were worth more than gold. A copy of the correspondence between Marquis Son Gi-hun and the emissary from the Twilight Court. 4 letters. The first was sent 8 months ago, immediately after the failed inspection. The second, 2 months later. The third after the duel with Jihua. The fourth, the longest and most detailed, with dates, routes, the locations of garrisons, and the thickness of the walls of every crowned fortress, was sent 3 weeks before the invasion. The Marquis saw the papers. His expression did not change. It hardly changed at all. But Doyun wasn't looking at his face. He was looking at his hands. The Marquis's hands rested on the granite table. His fingers were relaxed. A second after he saw the papers, his fingertips turned white. A microscopic squeeze. A microscopic movement of his cheekbone. A clenching of his jaw. A crack in the foundation. Doyun saw the cracks. He always did. The council reached for the papers. Lord Kim Hyun-sik took the first sheet. He read it. He turned pale. He passed it to the person next to him. The sheet made its way around the room. With each person who read it, the silence in the hall grew heavier. General Park did not read it. He looked at the Marquis with the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who had spent 30 years defending the border that the Marquis had spent 30 years destroying. His right hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Not a threat, a habit. But the Marquis saw it. The Marquis reached for the documents, slowly, as if for a chess piece he was about to remove from the board. Doyun covered the papers with his palm, calmly, without a sudden movement. His palm rested on the sheet, and the stone of the table beneath his hand glowed faintly. The Marquis pulled his hand away, not because of physical force. Doyun was F rank. He couldn't have physically held back the hand of an SS rank swordsman. The Marquis pulled his hand away from Doyun's gaze. Doyun was looking at him, just as he would look at a wall in which he had found a crack, with cold, professional interest, without malice, without triumph, with the precision of a master who sees a weak spot and knows that the structure is beyond repair. The Marquis leaned back. His hand slid toward his belt, toward his sword. A reflex. 30 years in politics, and his body remembers that it is an SS-ranked ice blade. His body remembers that a single strike settles any dispute. Yoon Se-byun stepped forward. 1 step from the wall. A small step by a small woman in a black robe. The hall fell silent. Se-byun turned to the king. Her voice was quiet, steady. dead with the weight of what she was about to say. She spoke the words that shook the hall. "Your Majesty, if he activates this building now, we're all dead. I've measured it. There are 300,000 units in these walls. He's alone." Silence. Absolute silence. 300,000. The number hung in the air like a knife. The lords exchanged glances. Not all of them grasped the scale of it. General Park understood. He slowly withdrew his hand from his sword. Prince Chue Gon-ho understood. He sat pale and motionless. Yoon Se-byeon understood it best of all. She had just spoken aloud what she had kept silent for 8 months. An F-rank builder had accumulated more mana in the walls of a single hall than any battle mage could unleash in a lifetime. And that mana was bound to him, to his will. One decision, one movement, one word, and the stone around them would cease to be a defense and become a weapon. The walls would close in. The ceiling would collapse. The floor would cave in. The building would kill everyone inside and bury them beneath it. Marquis Song Gi-hoon sat motionless. His hand returned to the table, far from the sword. He understood. Not with his mind, with his body. With the instinct that had kept him alive in politics for 30 years. He was sitting in a foreign fortress, in a foreign building, within a foreign power's domain. And the master of this building looked at him with the calmness of a man who had no need for a sword, because surrounding him were 300,000 units of mana, each obeying a single command. Doyun spoke, calmly, no louder than usual, the same voice he used when discussing formulas with Minsu, or pins with Taegwon, with Chang-sik about guard placements. The voice of a man accustomed to speaking to stone, who knows that stone listens only to precise words. He said, "Your Majesty, I will build Hwagyong for you, a city that neither the Twilight Court nor the Abyss can enter, on my terms." The king was silent. He listened, his eyes unmoving, his hands on the table, a face that had shown no emotion for 30 years. "The first condition, Marquis Song Gi-hoon is accountable to the council for the correspondence you hold in your hands." 12 pairs of eyes turned toward the Marquis. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Second condition. The Tower of Seals opens the Sonmyeon archives. Yoon Se-byeon flinched. Those very archives, the ones she had ordered to be burned. The ones they managed to burn, and the ones they didn't. She closed her eyes. 30 years at the tower. 30 years on the side of lies. The third condition, the Han family estate is returned to the Han clan, a trifle compared to the first two, a grain of sand next to a mountain. But Doyun had started with this clan, from the basement, from the atlas, from the column in the palace where he'd found a crack in the masonry on the night he lost everything. That was personal. And the personal was more important than politics, because politics changes. But stone remains. The fourth condition. Doyun fell silent. For the first time during the entire conversation, he allowed himself a pause. A long one. A heavy one. Like a stone you hold aloft for too long before setting it into the masonry. Then he looked. Not at the king, at Crown Prince Chue Gon-ho. The prince sat at the end of the table, in ceremonial armor. Spotless. Not a scratch, not a dent. Armor that had never seen battle. A prince who had never built, never defended, never stood on the wall and listened to the enemy pounding against it. A prince who, 16 months ago, had tossed a copper liang at a young boy's feet and said that it was unbecoming for a girl of Yuri's blood to shiver beside a barn repairman. Doyun said he would tell the prince the fourth condition in person. Chue Gon-ho turned pale. He didn't blush, he turned pale. Like a wall upon which a shadow falls for the first time. Yuri sat by the wall, her hands on her knees, her knuckles white. She looked at Doyun, at the man she had loved since she was 8, when they'd hidden from the rain under a single raincoat and she'd held his little finger. At the man she had let go of, slowly, deliberately, like setting aside a broken thing. She didn't know who to look at Doyun, whom she had lost. at the prince she'd been married off to, who turned out to be nothing but empty armor, at the father who was led away with his back straight and a stony face. She didn't know. For the first time in her life, Son Yuri, the icy B-class maiden, daughter of a marquis, didn't know what to do. The king remained silent. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The hall held its breath. The stone waited. Mana waited. The people waited. Then the king slowly nodded. A single movement. Heavy. Final. Like a stone set into a wall, never to be moved again. 2 guards approached the marquis. They stood on either side of him. The marquis rose on his own before they could help him up. SS rank. The icy blade. 30 years at the head of the Council of 12. He could have fought. He could have killed the guards with a single move. He could have tried to break through. But he was standing in Doyun's building. 300,000 units inside, and Doyun never took his eyes off him. The marquis walked toward the door, back straight. His stride was steady, the face of a man who had lost but would not allow himself to stumble on his way out. He stopped at the door, turned around, looked at Doyun. For a long time. And Doyun saw in his eyes not hatred, not rage, not a plea. Acknowledgement. Marquis Song Gi-hoon had not lost to a sword, not to magic, not to intrigue, not to money, not to connections. He had lost to a stone, to patience, to a boy with an F rank and a pencil behind his ear who, for 16 months, had been placing stone upon stone upon stone while the marquis moved pieces on the board. The marquis played chess. Doyun built a wall, and the wall proved to be heavier. The door closed. The council was adjourning. The lords rose to their feet. They whispered. They dispersed. General Pak lingered. He approached Doyun, placed a hand on his shoulder, a heavy hand, like a stone. He said nothing. He withdrew his hand. He left. The king was the last to leave. He approached the wall of the hall, slowly, like a man entering a temple. He placed his palm on the stone, just as General Park had once done, just like Yoon Se-byeon, just like everyone who had touched Doyun's work and realized that the seals were lying. He stood there. 10 seconds. 20. The stone was warm, alive, pulsing. The king withdrew his hand. He turned to Doyun and said that the wall was warm. Doyun replied that all his walls were warm. The king nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked quietly. He asked how long Doyun had known about the marquis. Doyun replied that it had been since the 4th month, when the Black Crane mercenaries arrived. Mercenaries aren't hired from the capital for a village no one has ever heard of. Someone must have known. Someone must have given the order. The chain of events led to one name. The king was silent again. Then he asked why Doyun had waited. Why hadn't he sent the evidence sooner? Doyun answered with a single sentence. He said that the wall must be completed before you reveal a crack in someone else's. The king looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded and left. Doyun remained alone in the hall. The glow in the walls slowly faded. It didn't go out. It dimmed. The stone relaxed, like a beast retracting its claws. Doyun sat down. He placed his pencil on the table. He closed his eyes. 16 months. 16 months since the day Yuri's fingers slipped off his little finger. A copper liang in his pocket. An atlas in a bag. The road north. He opened his eyes. He took the copper liang out of his pocket. That very one. Worn. With the coat of arms on one side. He placed it on the table. He looked at it. For a long time. Then he picked it up and pressed it into the stone tabletop. The stone accepted the coin. Melted it in. The copper became part of the granite. A mark. A memory. A reminder. This is where it all began. This is where it all came back to. Doyun stood up and left. It was the morning of his last day in Paesan as Doyun knew it. Tomorrow he would head north. To the Nexus. To the foundation of Hwegyong. But first, he had to finish 2 conversations. The first awaited him in the corridor of the council chamber. Crown Prince Choi Gon-ho stood against the wall, alone, without an entourage, without guards, in ceremonial armor that he wore like a foreign skin. He had been waiting since nightfall. He hadn't slept. Doyun walked past him and nodded toward the door of a small room at the end of the hallway. They went inside. Doyun closed the door. The room was empty. Stone walls, stone floor, a single window, no furniture. Doyun didn't sit down. Neither did the prince. They stood facing each other. F rank and A rank. Builder and heir. 16 months ago, the distance between them was measured in ranks and titles. Now it was measured in walls. Doyun spoke, quietly, without malice, without vengeance, with the precision of a craftsman reading a blueprint aloud. He said he wouldn't demand an apology, that apologies are just words, but he works with stone. That the fourth condition was simple. The prince would build it. He wouldn't order it to be built. He wouldn't pay for the construction. He would build it himself, with his own hands. One wall, in any village on the northern border. According to the blueprints that Doyun will give him. Without servants, without magic, without an A-rank emission. With his hands. Stone by stone, mortar in the joints, until his hands start to bleed. Until he understands what it means to lay stones every day. Until he learns what it feels like to be the man they call the barn repairman. The prince listened. His face was pale. His lips were pressed together. Eyes that, 16 months ago, had looked down on the world from above and seen nothing beneath their own rank. Now those eyes looked up at Doyun from below. Not because Doyun was taller. He wasn't. But because the walls of Peksan stood between them. Walls that the Reaper had failed to breach. Walls against which the A-rank son of a marquis had been shattered. Walls within which 24,000 people lived. And all these walls had been built by the man to whom the prince had tossed a copper coin. The prince was silent for a long time. A minute. 2. Then he nodded. He took off his breastplate. He took off his shoulder guards. He took off his greaves. He laid them on the floor, a pile of white steel bearing the crown crest. He stood there in a simple shirt. Thin, pale, without armor, without rank, without a title. Just a man. He said he would build it. Doyun looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled a pencil from behind his ear. He held it out. The prince took it. He held it uncertainly, like a weapon he'd never learned to use. Doyun said he'd start with the pencil, with a drawing, with calculations, and then stone. The prince nodded. Doyun left. The second conversation awaited him on the wall. Sun Jihua stood on the gatehouse platform and looked south. He had arrived at night, quietly, without his white armor, in traveling clothes, alone. He had seen his father being led away. He stood in the shadows and watched. He didn't intervene. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't shout. He just stood and watched. The A-rank heir to the Sun clan, who 3 months ago had lost a duel to an F-rank builder and left with questions. Those questions had brought him home. Home led him to the answers. He found his father's study. He found a box. He found drafts of letters. He found calculations. He found a map marked with which fortresses were underfunded and which garrisons were only 1/3 staffed. He found it and realized that his father had been trading away the northern border for 20 years. For 20 years, he had been selling land that Jihua considered sacred. He'd been lying for 20 years. Doyun stood beside him, silently. 2 men on the wall. One had built this wall. The other had tried to tear it down. Now both were looking south. Jika spoke first. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness on his father's behalf, that his father would answer for himself. He said he had come for something else. Doyun waited. Jika turned to him. His eyes were red from sleeplessness, or from something else. He said that after the duel, he'd spent 3 months thinking, that he'd pounded the wall for 4 hours and the wall hadn't cracked, that he'd broken 2 swords, that his whole life he'd been taught that strength is measured by how much you can destroy, that he was an A rank, the Academy's top graduate, the Ice Blade, and he couldn't break the wall that an F rank had built in 2 days. What does that mean? That his rank is worthless? Or that ranks don't mean anything at all? Or that the world isn't the way he was told it was? He fell silent. Doyun stood there and listened. The wind blew from the north, cold, smelling of smoke and distant lands. Doyun replied. He said that a rank means exactly what it measures: active emission, the ability to burn. But that's just one scale. There's another. Structural. The ability to build. The ability to carve into stone what will remain after you're gone. The seals don't see this scale. The tower doesn't want them to see it.
Because if the world learns that creation is stronger than destruction, then all the power of the tower and the council and everyone who sits at the top simply because they know kill better than others will collapse in a single day. Jihua listened, silently. Then he asked what Doyun wanted from him. Doyun replied that he wanted nothing. Jihua owed him nothing. No apology, no service, no sword. But if Jihua wanted to understand, then let him stay. Let him watch. Let him learn to see the world not through a scope but through a blueprint. Jihua stood on the wall he had been unable to break through and looked at the man who had built it. Then he nodded. Not as a lord to a subordinate. Not as an A rank to an F rank. As a student to a master. Doyun nodded in response. They stood on the wall for a long time, in silence. Then Doyun climbed down. The day was spent in preparations. The council was in session. General Park was forming a column. The Northern Army. The Peksan militia. Yeonju's mercenaries. 3,000 fighters. Not to defeat a 16,000-strong legion. To buy time. 48 hours. Tiguan was forging. 20 rune-inscribed spikes, the last batch of ore brought in before the siege. Each pin took 6 hours to forge. Each carried a rune that Tiguan wove with all his B-rank mana. He didn't complain. He didn't grumble. He forged in silence, with the face of a man doing the best work of his life and knowing it. Minsu was packing her backpack. 5 notebooks, 3 brushes, ink, a ruler, a protractor. 200 pages of the atlas that she had copied by hand and memorized. She knew that Doyun would tell her to stay. She knew she wouldn't stay. Changsik was checking on the men. He was posting guards, assigning quartermasters to each district. Baeksan must survive as long as its builder is in the north. 24,000 people, warehouses, a hospital, a school, the mana grid. Everything must function. The old man with the unyielding hand took charge of the city as one takes a watch, calmly, as if it were second nature, as if he'd been preparing for this his whole life. Yeonju was sharpening her swords, both of them, the long one for battle, the short one for close quarters. Her mercenaries were checking their gear. 40 men who, 6 months ago, had come to kill Doyun. Now they were following him, not for money, for the walls, for warm stone and clean water, and the certainty that there was a place on the continent that would never fall. That evening, Doyun entered his workshop for the last time. He gathered his tools, an axe, a shovel, and a spare pencil, because he'd given the first one to the prince. The Sonrion Atlas. The same bag he'd arrived in Peksan with 16 months ago. The bag felt heavier, not because of the items inside, because of their significance. He looked at the shelf. 13 letters, sealed, untouched. The stack had grown over the past 16 months, a small wall of paper. He stood before them and said nothing, for a long time. Then he turned and walked out. Minsu was waiting at the gate, a full backpack, eyes wide open. Doyun looked at her. He said she was staying. Minsu said no. Her voice was steady. No tremor, no pleading. With a certainty he'd only ever heard in stone. She said she was the only one besides him who knew the formulas. That if he fell at the 30th hour, someone had to continue the masonry. That she had read 200 pages of the atlas and memorized every letter of every formula in every blueprint. That she wasn't an orphan from Namchan, who counted stones by the roadside to keep from remembering. She was Master Han's apprentice, and she will go. Doyun looked at her. At the 17-year-old girl who had walked with him from the ashes of a burned-down village to a city of 24,000 souls.
who used to count stones and now counts mana, who recorded every number of every battle every day. His apprentice, his first student, the first in 1,000 years to read the Sonrion Atlas outside the Han clan. He nodded. Tegwan stood beside him, a hammer on his shoulder, spikes at his back. Next to him was Chang Sik. He went to see him off, but Doyun knew the old man would reach the gates and turn back. The city needed him. Yongju was nearby. 2 swords, 40 mercenaries. Doyun looked at each of them, at the people who had come to him when he had nothing, at the people who had become his wall, his foundation, his masonry. The gates opened. Doyun stepped out. A figure passed by him. Yuri. She was standing by the wall in the shadows, waiting, not with her entourage, alone, in a simple traveling dress, without jewelry, without the Sun family crest. She looked at Doyun.
He looked at her. For the first time in 16 months, their eyes met. 1 second, 2, 3. Yuri didn't cry. She didn't reach out her hand. She didn't say a word. She just stood there. She just looked at him. Doyun walked past her. He stopped after 2 steps. He didn't turn around. He said quietly, almost to himself, "Don't open the next letter until I return." Yuri shuddered. He knew. He knew what she had written. He knew he hadn't read it. And for the first time in 16 months, he let her know he would return. He'd come back, and maybe he'd open it. Maybe. He walked on. He didn't turn around. The gate closed behind him. The battle for the pass lasted 2 days. General Park fought as he had in his youth. His B+ rank resounded with every blow. The Northern Army held the flanks. Paksan's militia stood in the center, fighting to the death because their builder was following behind them, and they had no right to let the enemy through. Khan Muran, the Reaper, sensed it. He sensed where the F rank was headed, toward the node, toward the point that the Twilight Court had guarded for 500 years, the one that must not be ignited.
The Reaper abandoned his legion and went alone. Doyun reached the node at dawn on the 2nd day. An empty field, scorched earth, dead grass, dead stone, a dead place. But beneath his feet, there was a hum. The node was waiting. It had been waiting for 1,000 years, like a heart that had stopped but not died. Doyun took off his sack. He pulled out the atlas. He opened the last page, the page he had never shown to anyone, not even Minsu. The formula for the first stone, the beginning of everything, the foundation of foundations. He knelt down. He pressed his palms to the ground. The ground was cold, dead. He began. The first stone was laid in the ground, a simple stone, gray granite, indistinguishable from a million others. But Doyun imbued it with the formula, and the node flared up. Not blue, white, blinding. Light burst from beneath the earth like a geyser. It rose in a pillar toward the sky and spread across the land, along invisible lines, along the dormant nerves of a millennia-old network, from node to node. White flashes on the horizon. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. People across the continent saw them. A farmer in the central province dropped his hoe when the ground beneath his feet lit up. A fisherman off the southern coast cast his net when the water in the cove grew warm and clear. A lord in the capital's castle gripped the balcony railing when the ancient masonry beneath his hands trembled and came to life. Yoon Sabyeon stood on the wall of Paesan and wept, open, unashamed. She felt every knot, every single one. 57 white hearts beat within the continent's body for the first time in 1,000 years. And each beat in time with the stone that an F-rank boy was laying on his knees in the mud at the edge of the abyss. Kang Muryeon ran up, an SS-rank Reaper at full speed, the dead passage technique, his hands black with death mana. He saw the light, saw the knot, saw the builder on his knees, defenseless, F-rank, no combat mana, no weapons, no armor. A strike. A gray beam flew toward Doyun. Min-so stepped between them. Small, thin, 17 years old. She raised her hands and mana surged from the ground through her palms, solidifying into a wall. The architect's shield formula. 200 pages of the atlas. She remembered every one. The shield met the beam. Min-so flinched. Blood from her nose, from her ears, from the corners of her eyes. An SS rank strike in the hands of a 17-year-old girl with no combat rank. She held it. 3 seconds. 4. Taegwon was nearby. A hammer. A spike. He drove it into the ground. He activated it. The spike glowed. The shield took on a framework. It became a wall. A real one. A stone wall. Born of mana and steel. Kang Muryeon struck again. The wall absorbed the blow. He struck a third time. A fourth. The wall stood. Like all of Doyon's walls. Yeonju was nearby, 2 swords. Her mercenaries, 38 out of 40. They'd lost 2 during the breakthrough. They couldn't wound an SS-ranked Reaper, but they stood their ground, between him and the builder. They stood because behind them was a man worth standing for. Doyun was building. The 2nd stone, the 3rd, the 5th, the 20th, the 100th. His hands were covered in blood. His fingernails were torn off. Mana flowed through him like a river through its bed. Not his mana, the mana of the node, the mana of the earth, the mana of a millennia-old grid that was awakening and flowing toward a single point. Into his hands. Into the stone. Into the foundation of the city that would stand when everyone here had turned to dust. The counter had ceased to be a number. 200,000. 300. 500. The mark on his collarbone glowed. Not with the blue-gray light of a beggar's lantern. White. Pure. Like the node. Like the grid. Like a continent. Khan Moran stepped back. At the 42nd hour, the SS-ranked Reaper, who had burned 3 fortresses with a single spell, retreated from the wall being built by the girl counter, the outcast blacksmith, the mercenary trader, and the F-ranked boy kneeling in the mud. He retreated because the wall was growing faster than he could destroy it. Fegyeon's foundation was completed 46 hours later. Doyun fell face first to the ground. Min-so caught him. Taegwon caught him. Yeonju stood with her sword at the ready. All around them, the ground glowed white for about 3 li. The foundation. The base. The first level of a city that does not yet exist, but is already alive. 240,000 units. Architect of Seals 1. General Park's army arrived by evening. The Twilight Court Legion was retreating in all directions. The grid was awakening. The ancient walls in their path came to life. Stone that had slept for 1,000 years rose before them as a wall. The road back to Paeksan. Doyun walked alone, slowly, with difficulty, leaning on Min-so, who could barely stand herself. 24,000 people stood at the city gates, in silence. When Doyun entered, they parted, quietly, like water before a rock. He reached the square, the well, the first one, the very one. He placed his palm on the stone. The stone responded, warm, alive, pulsing, connected to every stone in the city, to every wall on the continent. With Hwegyong's foundation at the node 100 li to the north, with the awakening network that enveloped Haryong like a nervous system, Doyun stood by the well and felt the entire continent, every stone, every wall, every node, 57 white hearts, and they were all beating. In the evening, he went into his study. He sat down at the desk. He looked at the stack of letters. 13. He didn't touch them. He looked at the map. 57 nodes. 5 fully activated. 23 awakened. The rest are waiting. He needs time. Years. But he has time, because the walls are still standing. Then Yuri came, alone, in a simple dress. She stood by the door. She didn't come in. She looked at the stack of letters. She was silent. Doyun was sketching. He didn't look up. Yuri said she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness. that she knew she didn't deserve it, that she wanted to know just one thing. Had he opened even one of them? Doyun remained silent. His pencil glided across the paper. Then he answered, "No, not a single one." Yuri nodded. She turned toward the door. She stopped at the threshold. She said that every letter contained the same thing. One sentence, 13 times. Doyun didn't ask what it was. Yuri left. The door closed. Doyun sat and stared at the letters. For a long time. The copper liang on the council table. The pencil in the prince's hands. Jiwa's nod on the wall. Sebyong's tears. Taguan's hammer. Minsu's shield. Changsik's spears. Yeonju's swords. The 24,000 men standing outside his walls. The 13 letters he hadn't opened. The single seal that no longer glowed blue-gray. He returned to the blueprint. Minsu arrived that night. Her face was still pale from the shield, a bandage on her arm. But her eyes were ablaze. A report in her hand. Intelligence from Yeonju in the far north. From beyond the Twilight Court line. From the abyss. Doyun took it. He read it. And his expression changed. For the first time in 16 months. Not fear. Not anger. Not triumph. Surprise. Pure. Like a child who found a page in a familiar book that hadn't been there before. In the far north, beyond the Twilight Court line, beyond the reach of all maps and all knowledge, in the very depths of the abyss, something had awakened. Something was being built. The scouts saw walls. Black. Made of stone that doesn't exist on the continent. Smooth. Seamless. Without mortar. Rising straight from the ground, as if alive. Like Doyun's walls, only the opposite. A mirror image. An alien grid. Alien nodes. Alien formulas. Not destruction. Not an army. Not a legion. Construction. Someone or something in the abyss was responding to the awakening of the Sonrion grid with its own grid. Dark. Alien. Unknown. Doyun rolled up the report. He placed it on the table. He stood up. He walked over to the window. Beyond the window, Peksan glowed. 24,000 lights in the windows. Warm stone. Living walls. His city. Beyond the horizon to the north, white dots of awakened nodes. The Sonrion grid. His work. And even further. Beyond all the nodes. Beyond all the dots and walls and fortresses and cities. In the very heart of the darkness, something was building in response. Something ancient. Something immense. Something that gazed upon the light of his nodes and answered with its own light. Black. And it was no smaller than him. Perhaps even larger. Doyun stood by the window. A pencil tucked behind his ear. A white seal on his collarbone. 204,000 units of structural mana. Seal Architect 1. Behind him lay 16 months of bloodstone, silence, and patience. Ahead lay Huegyong, the city that cannot be taken. And behind him, the darkness that builds. He picked up the pencil, twirled it between his fingers, looked at Minsu. She stood there waiting, eyes wide open, a bandage on her arm, blood still not quite washed off her chin. His student, the first in 1,000 years. He said quietly, calmly, just as he spoke of masonry, of mortar, of formulas, as if he were talking about the next block in the wall rather than the darkness that had awakened at the edge of the world. He said it was good. That meant he now had a true conversation partner. He tucked the pencil back behind his ear, sat down at the table, unfolded a blank sheet of paper, and began to sketch. The lines flowed onto the paper, smooth, precise, alive. The outlines of a city that didn't yet exist. The outlines of walls that would stand when everything else fell. The outlines of the future. Minsu sat down beside him. She took out her notebook. She prepared her brush. She began to count. As always. Just like on the very first day. The warm stone of the wall shimmered white. Outside the window, Peksan breathed, slept, and lived. And far, far away in the north, in the darkness, an answer was taking shape.